Rain came sideways that night, not the kind that blesses dry ground, the kind that punishes. It hammered the musk flats until the earth gave up and simply let the water run, sheet after sheet of silver under a thin moon. For a lone rider sat low in the saddle, hat brimmed down, driving 6 stubborn cattle that refused to go home. Found metal on stone, chains, he reined up. Only wind, only rain hissing off his slicker, or only his own heartbeat. He should have kept riding. He turned toward the sound instead. A quarter mile off the trail, beneath a dead cottonwood, a figure was bound. Ankles, 4, and around the throat an iron collar, crude and thick, blood-dried black beneath it, cracked open in thin fresh lines. Breech. Did not flinch, did not beg, only watched. Arizona Territory, 1878. The rain came sideways that night. Not gentle, not the kind that blesses a dry season and leaves everyone grateful come morning. This was the kind that punished, hammered the mesquite flats until the ground gave up trying to drink it and just let it run, sheet after sheet, silver in what little moonlight broke through. Roan Hargrove rode low in the saddle, hat brimmed down, collar up. 4. Because a man who has lost everything learns to stop fighting weather he cannot control and starts fighting instead whatever's directly in front of him. Which tonight was 6 head of cattle that did not want to go home. 32 years old, looked older some days. Grief does that to a face. Sits on a man's shoulders like a second coat, and no matter how many seasons pass, he never quite figures out how to take it off. The herd bunched near the wash, skittish, snorting into the wet dark. 4. And Roan almost didn't hear it over the storm. He reined up, listened. Nothing. Just wind, just rain hissing off his slicker, just his own heartbeat, steady, unremarkable, except there it was again, a drag, a clink. Rains do not sound like anything else in this world. 4. Once a man has heard that sound, really heard it, the way you hear a gunshot or a scream, he does not mistake it for something else. Not ever again. He should have kept riding. Should have finished the drive, gotten the herd behind fence, dried off by his own fire, and let whatever that sound belonged to stay someone else's trouble. Except he didn't. He turned the horse toward it. Instead, she was tied to a dead cottonwood a quarter mile off the trail, bound behind her with wet rawhide gone tight as wire. Ankles, too, crossed and lashed to the trunk, so she couldn't have run, even if the ropes at her wrists had given, and around her throat, catching what little moonlight broke, through the clouds, an iron collar. Thick, crude, the kind built for livestock, not for people. For blood had dried black beneath it, cracked open fresh in thin lines down her collarbone, where the metal had rubbed raw through days, maybe weeks. Struggle. Roan slid off his horse before he'd consciously decided to. She didn't flinch when he got close, didn't cower, didn't beg, didn't do any of the things his mind half expected in that first frantic second. Her eyes came up and found his, and held there steady. For even with her whole body shaking cold, blood loss, exhaustion, he couldn't tell which, probably all 3 at once. 24 years old, he'd guess. Tall for a woman, built lean and strong under the mud and rain, black hair plastered flat to her face. 4. And beneath all of it, beneath the blood, beneath the collar, beneath whatever hell had put her here, a stillness that unsettled him more than screaming ever could have. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. 4. Which felt like a foolish thing to say to a woman chained to a tree in a thunderstorm. 4. But it was the only true thing he had to offer, so he offered it. She said nothing. Just watched him the way a wolf watches a man trying to decide whether he's worth trusting. He knelt in the mud, reached for the rope at her wrists first. Hands were shaking too, for though he'd never have admitted it, through her, for not to himself. 4. Because it had been years, actual years, since he'd touched another living person like this. Carefully, like they mattered, like his hands still remembered how to be gentle. The rope came loose after a struggle. She didn't pull away once her arms were free, didn't rub the raw skin at her wrists the way most folks would, just kept watching him. Then the collar. He worked his numb fingers under the cold iron, found the crude latch at the back, fought it. Freezing rain running down the back of his own neck, his breath coming in short clouds. It didn't want to give. "Hold still," he muttered. She held still. Didn't so much as breathe wrong. until the latch finally broke. 4. And the collar dropped into the mud between them with a sound far too small for something that had clearly meant so much. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then she spoke, English, broken at the edges, careful with each word, but clear enough to land like a fist. You removed my collar, Cowboy. He looked up, still on his knees in the mud. By our law, she said, that makes you my husband. Roan laughed. Couldn't help it, a short disbelieving bark of a sound that came out of him before his brain had time to stop it. I ain't nobody's husband. You are now, lady. I don't know your law, don't know your people. 4. What I know is you're bleeding, and it's the middle of a storm, and my cattle are probably scattered halfway to Sonora by now, so you removed the collar. Flat, final. Like she was stating a fact of nature, the way a man might tell you the sun rises in the east, whether he wanted it to or not. That is the law. It does not care whether you know it. He stood, rain running off his hat brim in a steady stream, down the back of his slicker. I'm taking you somewhere dry, he said. That's all this is. She almost smiled at that. Almost. That is how it always starts. He got her onto the horse in front of him because she couldn't walk, not with the state of her leg. He hadn't even noticed the gash along her thigh until she tried to stand on her own and went white, swaying, catching herself hard against the cottonwood. The ride back took the better part of an hour. Neither of them said a word, which suited him fine. Talking had never come easy to Roan, not before the fire, and certainly not since. Because that was the cruel thing about grief, it doesn't make a man quieter by choice. It hollows out the part of him that used to reach for words. For leaves silence sitting there instead, where conversation used to live. He felt her shivering against him the whole ride, felt her trying and failing to hide it, and some old instinct in him, some buried, half-forgotten instinct, made him shift his own coat around her shoulders without a single word passing between them. She didn't thank him. 4. But she didn't shrug it off either. The Catin sat low against the hillside. One window glowed faint gold where he'd left a lamp burning, out of habit more than anything, though there was no one left inside to come home to any more. 3 other buildings sat further back the bunkhouse, the barn, and a smaller shed that used to be a nursery, and was now just a room full of tools he never used and never looked at directly if he could help it. He didn't think about that room, not tonight. For he got her down off the horse, and her leg buckled the second. Her boots hit the ground. He caught her before she fell, had to. For her whole weight against his chest for one long second, her breath ragged near his collar, and something about the closeness of it made his jaw go tight in a way he couldn't name. I can walk, she said into his shoulder. Sure you can, I can. Prove it once we're inside, for now. He didn't finish the sentence, just carried her through the door, firelight, warmth, the smell of wood smoke and wet leather. 4. He laid her on the narrow bed in the corner, the one that used to be his and his wife's, before he'd taken to sleeping on the floor rather than in it alone. 4. He hadn't thought about that either, not until this exact moment, watching a stranger bleed onto sheets that hadn't held another body in 3 years. He built up the fire, boiled water, found the little tin of carbolic salve he kept for the cattle, because it was the only medicine on the place and it would simply have to do. She watched him work with that same flat, careful stillness she'd worn at the cottonwood, sizing him up, finding something about him with every movement he made. What's your name? He asked, cleaning the raw line at her throat. Neva. Just Neva. Neva's enough. Roan, he offered, though she hadn't asked. Roan Hargrove. She repeated it under her breath, testing the shape of it. Quieter, almost to herself. Her husband's name should be known. We are not doing that again. We are not doing anything, she said. It is already done. He sat back on his heels. Studied her in the firelight the way a man studies a problem he doesn't know how to solve. I don't know what happened to you, he said. 4. Don't know who did this. He glanced toward the collar, still crusted with mud where he'd tossed it by the door, or why. But I'd pulled you off that tree, because leaving you there felt like something I couldn't live with. That's all it was. All it is. And yet her eyes didn't waver. You are the one who freed me. Anybody would have, no. Quiet, certain. Not anybody stops in a storm. Not anybody kneels in mud for a stranger's blood. He didn't have an answer for that. 4. Which was, he was starting to suspect, going to become something of a pattern. He slept on the floor that night, didn't even think twice about it, though the boards were hard and the fire burned low by 2 in the morning, and his back would ache come sunrise. 4. Because that bed hadn't truly been his in 3 years. 4. Not really. It belonged to a version of him that didn't exist anymore, and hadn't, since the night everything he'd built got taken from him in the space of a few terrible minutes. 4. He woke twice to the sound of her breathing changing shallow, then deep, then shallow again. Fever, moving through her like weather moves through the desert, unpredictable and total. Runs. He woke to find her sitting bolt upright, eyes wide open but somewhere far away, murmuring words in a language he didn't know, a lullaby maybe, or a prayer. He couldn't tell the difference and didn't ask. He just got up, wrung out a cloth in the basin, pressed it gently to her forehead until her breathing slowed again. She never fully woke, never knew he'd done it. He told himself that was fine. Told himself he hadn't done it to be thanked. 4. Except some part of him quieter, harder to ignore, knew that wasn't entirely true. By morning the storm had blown itself out, leaving the desert scrubbed clean and shining. Every cactus spine catching the light like it had been dipped in glass overnight. Fever hadn't broken. If anything, it had worsened. 4. Her leg was hot to the touch, swollen tight at the edges of the wound, and Rowan stood over her with a kind of helpless dread only a man who has already buried people can carry. He'd seen this before, knew what infection looked like, knew exactly what it could do once it got into the blood, how fast a strong young body could go from fighting to failing. I need to open the wound again, he said. Clean it proper this time, it's going to hurt. Her eyes opened, found his. He's sick, even burning up. There was iron in that look. 4. Then do it. You sure? I did not survive Moreno's camp by being afraid of pain, Cowboy. That name landed on him. Strange. Moreno. He filed it away without yet knowing it would come to mean everything. He worked fast and rough, because gentleness would only prolong it. She didn't scream. Didn't so much as whimper. Gripped the edge of the bed frame until her knuckles went white. 4. And breathed through her teeth in short, green pulls. 4. And stared at the ceiling like she was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far from this cabin, far from this pain, far maybe from him. 4. When it was done he wrapped the leg tight in clean cloth and sat back, breathing hard himself, though he'd done none of the suffering. There, he said. Rest now. You are shaking, she said. So are you. Mine is fever. A pause. Yours is something else. He didn't answer that. Went outside to check on the herd, because some things were easier to face than a stranger seeing straight through him on the first morning they'd known each other. The days that followed blurred together the way days do when a whole household is quietly holding its breath. Fever broke on the 3rd day. Rowan remembered because he'd been up half the night before, convinced it wouldn't, convinced he was about to bury a second stranger on land that already held too many graves. He hadn't dug himself, but felt responsible for all the same. 4th day she was sitting up, sharp-eyed and irritable, which he decided to take as a good sign. By the 6th she was arguing with him about getting out of bed entirely. You'll tear it open again. I have been lying here for 6 days, because you nearly died. I did not nearly die, flat. Burton. I have had worse. That stopped him cold. He wanted to ask what worse looked like, wanted to ask about Moreno, about the collar, about the thin white scars he'd noticed on her wrists that were older than this ordeal, a story he hadn't earned the right to hear yet. He didn't ask. Not yet. She was on her feet by the 2nd week, limping but upright, and the first thing she did once he wasn't watching closely enough was walk the whole perimeter of the ranch. Slow, deliberate. She was memorizing every rock and fence post for a test only she knew was coming. He found her out by the north fence line, one hand braced against a post, testing her weight on the bad leg. You're supposed to be resting. I have rested enough for 10 winters. Leg says otherwise. Leg does not get a vote. He almost laughed, caught himself. Stubborn. For alive, she corrected. There is a difference, though I understand why a man who has never worn a collar might confuse the two. That one landed harder than she probably meant it to, or maybe exactly as hard as she meant it to. He was starting to learn. He could never quite tell with her, for the ranch hands noticed her before Rowan had a real chance to explain anything, and word of a strange woman living in the main cabin spread through a 3-man bunkhouse, the way word spreads through any small place fast and mostly wrong. Otis saw her first. 4. An old man, weathered like driftwood, who'd worked this land since before Rowan was old enough to sit a horse alone. 4. He went pale at first sight of her, then wary, then true to form, read absolutely nothing about it, for Otis was practically a full sermon. Frank was younger, quicker to worry, and kept his hand resting near his belt for the better part of that first week whenever she came into view. Neva noticed, Neva did not appreciate it. "Prelim," she said to Rowan one evening, jerking her chin toward Frank across the yard, "stop looking at me like I am a rattlesnake. He has not decided whether to shoot. Careful, that's all. He is afraid. Can you blame him? You showed up here half dead and wearing iron. Man doesn't know what to make of that." Then he should ask. Would you answer? She considered that a long moment before weighing it the way she seemed to weigh everything, like words cost something, and she didn't spend them carelessly. No. Well, he almost smiled. There you go. The third hand, Emmett, was different, quieter than the other two, watchful in a way Rowan mistook at the time for simple shyness. For Emmett never said much to Neva directly, a polite, respectful distance, his work same as always. 4. But Rowan would catch him sometimes, standing at the fence line a beat too long, studying the far horizon like he was waiting on something that hadn't arrived yet. Rowan didn't think much of it, 4, because that was the trouble with a man like Emmett. He never gave you a reason to look twice, not until it was already too late to matter. The turn with Otis came 3 weeks in on a morning nobody planned for a calf had wandered off from the herd overnight young, not yet a month old, the kind of animal that draws wolves the way blood draws flies. Found the tracks first, or called out across the pasture. 4. And by the time Rowan reached the north fence line, 2 wolves already had the calf pinned against a low rock outcrop. 4. And Otis's rifle wasn't going to clear a shot without catching the calf too. Neva was moving before Rowan had finished understanding what he was looking at. She came at the wolves low and fast, no weapon but a coiled length of rope and her own voice, sharp and strange, for words he didn't recognize thrown out into the morning air like stones. The bigger wolf broke first, peeling off toward the brush line. The second held its ground half a second longer, long enough for Neva to close the last few yards and put her own body between the calf and its teeth. Ran too, eventually. They always did. Once they understood the cost wasn't worth the meal. Otis got there a moment later, breathing hard, staring at Neva like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in his life. That was a damn fool thing to do, he said. From Otis was practically an ovation. Calf is alive, Prince, checking its legs for injury, entirely unbothered by having just walked between herself and 2 hungry wolves with nothing but her bare hands and her voice. Could have been you instead of the calf. It was not. Otis looked at Rowan, back at her, and something in his weathered old face shifted, some suspicion he'd been carrying since the first night finally setting its weight down. "Ma'am," he said, "the first time anyone on the ranch had called her that you got sand. I'll say that for you, for I do not know what sand means in this. Means you're worth having around." He picked his hat back up off the ground where it had fallen. "That's all it means, ma'am. Nothing more complicated than that." She didn't smile. 4. But something in her shoulders eased, just slightly, in a way Rowan noticed even if she never meant for him to see it. 4. After that morning, Otis started leaving a second cup of coffee out most mornings without being asked. Neva never commented on it, never needed to. Frank came around slower, the way cautious men always do. 4. But even he stopped keeping his hand near his belt by the 5th week. 4. And one evening actually laughed, really laughed, loud enough to startle the horses, when Neva bested him at knife throwing behind the barn, 3 clean hits to his 1. For only Emmett stayed exactly the same, polite, competent, watching the far horizon a beat too long, same as he always did, and Rowan still didn't think anything of it, for not yet. Supper that first month was its own kind of battlefield, quiet and small, fought over nothing more dangerous than food. Reva cooked bone broth thick with wild herbs. She gathered herself, roots Rowan didn't recognize, bark shaved thin and simmered until the whole cabin smelled like something older than either of them. "What is that?" he asked the first time, eyeing the bowl with open suspicion. "Food. Smells like a saddle boiled in creek water. Eat it anyway." "Why?" Because your body does not know how to heal itself the way mine does. It only knows how to keep working until it breaks. She set the bowl down in front of him with a finality that left no room for argument. It will help, or it will not. Either way, you will eat it. He ate it. It was, infuriatingly, better than anything he'd cooked himself in 3 years. Don't tell Otis, he said, scraping the bowl clean. Man's been feeding me his own cooking for 3 years, thinking he was doing me a favour. I will not tell Otis. He'll ask why I stopped eating his stew. Tell him your stomach has developed better judgment. That's a good way to get myself murdered before Moreno ever finds this place. The corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, close enough that he noticed. You are learning, she said. Learning what? How to make a joke land. She took his empty bowl without asking. It took you long enough. I make jokes. You make noises that sound like jokes. There is a difference. She set the bowl in the wash basin. This was almost an actual one. I praise. I do not give praise easily. For she said it plainly. For a boast. Fact. The way she said most things. For when I do, it is because it is earned. He sat with that a moment, something warm settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the broth. For the argument about the marriage law came back around more than once, circling like a hawk that hadn't found its kill yet. You keep saying it like it's settled, he said one night, both of them at the small table, fire between courses of an argument that had started over something as small as whether to salt the meat before or after cooking. Rot settled. I didn't agree to any of it. Agreement is not required. Where I come from it is. For where you come from, he said. For a man can take a woman's whole life and call it a wedding. And no law asks either of them what they agreed to first. A pause, sharp enough to cut. My people's law asks something different. It asks who was willing to kneel in the mud for a stranger. It does not ask permission from the man who benefits from the answer. Silenced him for a long moment. So it's not really about husbands and wives at all, he said finally. Is it? It is about who is willing to be responsible. She met his eyes across the fire. That is all marriage ever really is, Cowboy. Everything else is just decoration. For he didn't have a comeback for that. For he was starting to keep a mental list of things he had no response to when it came to her, and the list kept growing longer every single week she stayed. For you ever gonna let me off the hook? For he asked, stroking. Not. Is this a lifetime sentence? That depends. On what? On whether you turn out to be worth the trouble. She said it without looking up from the fire, and he couldn't tell, in that light, whether she was teasing him or simply being honest. For with her he was learning. Those two things were not always easy to tell apart. And if I'm not, then I will find a different cottonwood. A pause, just long enough to land. There is no shortage of them in this territory. He laughed. Actually laughed. Frowned, surprising him even now. Weeks in, like his own chest hadn't fully caught up to the fact that laughter still lived in there somewhere. She didn't laugh with him. But she didn't look away either, and the fire between them burned a little brighter than the wood alone could account for. He taught her to sit a saddle the cowboy way instead of riding bareback, and she took to it faster than he wanted to admit, faster than most grown men he'd broken horses alongside over the years. You're leaning too far forward. I am not. You're about to go over that horse's neck. I am not. She went over the horse's neck. Landed in a controlled roll in the dirt that told him this wasn't the first time she'd hit ground hard and gotten straight back up. She was on her feet again before he'd even finished reaching for her, brushing dust off her sleeves with an expression daring him to say a single word about it. He didn't laugh. Wanted to. Didn't, again, she said. You sure? Again, she got back on the horse. She taught him to read sign in the dirt, the difference between a rabbit's panic scramble and its slow evening wander, the way a snake's trail told you, its length, before you ever saw it coiled somewhere in the shade. You're not looking right, she said, crouched beside a faint scuffed line in the sand that meant absolutely nothing to him. I'm looking exactly where you're looking. You are looking at the ground. I am looking at the story the ground is telling. Same thing. For it is not the same thing at all. She traced the line with one finger, careful not to disturb it. This animal was frightened. See how the print drags here, then lifts clean. Something startled it, something close. Could have been anything. It was a fox. She stood, scanning the brush line without hurry. There is coyote sign a quarter mile that way. Fox knew before we did. He looked at the empty scrubland around them, suddenly less empty than it had seemed a moment ago. How do you know all this? Because my mother taught me, the way her mother taught her. A pause, something distant crossing her face. 4. Before the world decided that knowledge was worth less than what a woman's body could be sold for, he didn't ask her to explain that. 4. Not yet. But he carried the sentence around with him the rest of the day, turning it over, the way a man turns over a stone he isn't ready to look under. He taught him to find water where the ground looked driest, reading some quiet language of plants and shadow he'd lived beside his entire life, without ever once learning to speak. Palo Verde, she said, pointing to a stand of green-barked trees along a dry wash. Roots go deep. 4. Where they grow thick like this, water is close beneath. How close? Dig and find out. He dug. 2 feet down, sand turned dark and cool, and by 3 feet it was wet enough to squeeze between his fingers. Well, I'll be damned, he said, sitting back on his heels, genuinely impressed for the first time since he'd known her. 4. You will be, he agreed, quite smiling, shortly. 4. Most men are. He taught her to use a rope, and laughed, actually laughed, a sound so unfamiliar in his own chest that it startled him more than it startled her. The first time she roped a fence post clean instead of the calf she'd been aiming at from 20 feet away. Do not laugh. I'm not laughing. You are laughing on the inside. I can see it in your face. Can't help what my face does. Then your face is a liar. She threw the rope again, missed again, this time by even more. 4. And when he laughed a second time, he didn't bother trying to hide it, and this time she didn't tell him to stop either. Just muttered something in her own language that he was fairly certain wasn't flattering, and threw the rope a third time. 4. There was a night 3 weeks in, maybe 4. The days had started running together in a way he didn't entirely mind anymore, when grief came for him the way it always did. Unannounced, uninvited, sudden as a storm blowing in off the mesa with no warning at all. He was sitting on the porch step with a bottle he rarely let himself finish, staring at nothing when it hit. He didn't cry. Cried in years. Some door in him had rusted shut a long time ago, and he'd stopped trying the handle. Just sat there, remembering a laugh that used to fill this exact porch, small hands that used to reach up for his before bedtime, for a life that had existed once and now only existed in the shape of its absence. He didn't hear Neva come out, didn't notice her settle a few feet away, careful to leave space between them until she started to hum, low, wordless at first. Then words came, in her own language, soft, rising and falling, like something being rocked gently to sleep. For a lullaby. He didn't need to understand the words to know. That's exactly what it was. Some songs don't require translation. The shape of them tells you everything you need to know. He didn't say anything when it ended, didn't trust his voice not to break. She didn't ask him to. Who, he finally managed, staring at the bottle instead of her, did you lose? To be able to sing like that, a long silence, long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. My mother, she said finally. My father. 2 brothers, a pause, and something in her voice went very quiet. Soldiers came for grazing land my people had held for 100 years, and decided the fastest way to take it was to take us instead. I'm sorry you did not do it. Doesn't mean I'm not sorry it happened. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark, something shifting behind her eyes that he couldn't quite name. No, she said, softer than he'd ever heard her. I suppose it does not. They sat there a while longer, 2 people who'd both buried something, letting the desert night hold the silence between them the way only a desert night can. She asked to see them a few days later. His wife, Fran, asked plainly, without any softening around the edges, the way she asked most things. He almost said no. For almost told her it was none of her business, that the small fenced plot behind the old nursery shed was his alone to carry, his alone to visit at dawn when he thought no one was watching. He didn't say no, for he led her out past the barn instead, through the 2 wooden markers, standing crooked in the morning light, weather-worn, the carved names softened by 3 years of sun and rain until they were barely legible anymore, for he hadn't replaced them. Some part of him had never been able to justify the expense of a stonecutter for wounds that money couldn't touch anyway. Neva stood a respectful distance, back at first. Let him have the space he needed. Her name was Sarah, he said, because it felt wrong. Suddenly, that she'd been living in Sarah's cabin, sleeping under Sarah's roof, without ever once hearing Sarah's name spoken aloud. Boy's name was Daniel. Wasn't but 2 years old. They were loved, Neva said. Not a question. A simple observation offered like a fact laid gently down beside him. Still are. His voice caught on it. Let it. Don't stop just because they're gone. She was quiet a moment. Then she knelt at the edge of the plot, careful, respectful, began to speak low, for in her own language, same cadence as the lullaby from the porch, though this was something else, for something with more weight to it. A blessing, maybe, or a request. He didn't ask which, and she didn't explain, and somehow that felt like exactly the right amount of understanding to have between them. When she finished, she looked up at him. In my language there is no word for goodbye. Only a word that means I will see you again, in whatever form the world allows. That a comfort, or just a nicer way of saying the same hard thing? Both, she said. Most true comforts are. He knelt beside her at the small fence. The first time in 3 years he'd let himself stay at that spot longer than it took to feel the guilt close back over him. I wasn't here, he said, quiet, through the markers more than to her. The day it happened. Cattle came home to smoke on the horizon, and got 2 hours too late, and got there 2 hours too late to do anything but bury what was left. Doesn't make it easier. No, she agreed. It does not, but it does make it not your fault. Those are different things, Cowboy, even when grief tries to convince you they are the same. He didn't answer that right away. Just stayed there a while, kneeling in the dust beside a woman who had lost just as much as he had, in front of 2 markers that had waited 3 years for someone besides him to finally kneel there too. For when they finally stood to walk back, frowned for the first time since the fire. For that the walk away from that small plot didn't feel like abandoning them all over again. Felt, instead, like finally being able to carry them forward instead of only backward. The nightmare came a few nights after that. He woke to a sound he didn't recognize at first, sharp, choked, half a word in a language that wasn't his, and by the time his eyes adjusted to the dark, he was already moving toward the bed. Neva was thrashing against the blankets, her eyes shut tight, one hand clawing at her own throat, like the collar was still there, like it had never actually left. Neva, he said it soft. Didn't touch her yet. Neva, you're here, you're safe. She didn't wake. Kept fighting something only she could see. Neva. Her eyes snapped open, wild, unseeing for one terrible second, somewhere with iron and rope and men whose names he was only beginning to learn. Then focus came back into her face. She saw him, saw the cabin, saw the fire burn down to embers. He yanked her hand away from her throat, like she was embarrassed to have been caught reaching for a wound that wasn't there anymore. I am fine, she said. Too fast. Didn't ask you were going to, wasn't actually. He crouched beside the bed, keeping his distance, giving her the space she'd need to decide for herself whether to close it. Was just going to sit here a minute, that's all. She didn't tell him to leave, so he stayed. Pratt on the floor beside the bed in the dark, praying nothing, until her breathing evened out again, and her hand finally came down from her throat and rested, empty, against the blanket. Thank you, she said, so quiet he almost missed it. It was the first time she'd said those words to him since the storm. He didn't make a thing of it, just nodded, once, and let the silence hold them both until morning. She said more about it the next day than he expected. Not much, but more. They were out mending fence, the kind of work that lets 2 people talk without having to look directly at each other, which he was start to understand. Was the only way she talked about anything that mattered. Moreno's camp, he said, apropos of nothing, hammering a post steady while he strung wire. It was not one bad night, you should know that. It was many nights. For many months he kept his hands moving, didn't stop, didn't look at her, let her set the pace. There were others, she went on. Women taken the same way I was taken. Some gave up fighting. I understood why, even when I could not forgive it. A pause, the hammer striking twice, hard. For I did not give up, not because I was braver, because giving up felt like it would kill something in me faster than Moreno ever could. How'd you end up tied to that tree? I tried to run 3 times. She said it flat, like a tally, like a fact with no feeling left attached to it, though he doubted that was entirely true. The 3rd time, I made it 2 days before they caught me. Moreno said, a woman who runs 3 times is not worth feeding any more. Said the desert could finish what he did not want to. Roan's jaw tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. He was wrong, he finally said. I know. She met his eyes for the first time since she'd started talking. I have known that since the moment you knelt in the mud instead of riding past. For he didn't know what to say to that. For went back to stringing wire instead, because his hands needed somewhere to put the feeling that had risen up in his chest, somewhere between anger and something else he wasn't ready to name yet. They worked the rest of the fence line in silence. But it was a different silence than before. Lighter, somehow, for having been broken at all. The dress incident happened not long after. He'd found it in the cedar trunk, one of the few things left folded and untouched for 3 years, because he hadn't had the heart to burn it, and hadn't had the strength to look at it directly either. When he finally held it out to her, awkward, unsure why he was even offering it, unsure what he'd expected her to do, he looked at the fabric like it was an accusation. I will not wear a dead woman's dress. He froze. How do you know it was? Because you held it like it might break you. A beat, her voice gentling just slightly. And because no man keeps a dress folded that carefully for 3 years unless it belonged to someone he buried and never quite finished burying. He put it away, didn't argue, didn't trust himself to. She kept wearing her own deerskin instead, mended now and then with strips of his old work shirts, when the leather finally gave out at the seams. And one morning he came outside to find she'd cut her own hair short on one side using his hunting knife uneven, deliberate, defiant, for dark strands scattered across the porch boards, like something offered up. Why'd you do that? Long hair is for women who do not fight. She tied the shorter side back with a leather cord, calm, unbothered by his stare. I fight. You didn't have to cut it for that, she agreed. I did not have to. I wanted to. She looked at him directly. There is a difference, Cowboy, between what a person has to do and what they choose. I am learning. I have not been allowed to choose very much for a very long time. This was mine to choose. He didn't have a response to that either. The list kept growing. Roan rode into the nearest town near the end of the 2nd month, needing supplies the ranch couldn't provide on its own, and found himself more distracted by the trip than he expected to be. Distracted by the quiet at the ranch behind him. Distracted, if he was honest with himself, by leaving her there without quite knowing why that bothered him. The town was small, dusty, main street lined with buildings that looked half-finished and permanent, at the same time a general store, saloon, squat little courthouse with a flag hanging limp in the windless heat. The store smelled like coffee and oiled leather. For the man behind the counter, for a heavy-set fellow named Purdy who'd known Rowan's father, loaded flour and salt and cartridges onto the counter, and made conversation the way men in small towns always did, which was to say, without ever quite asking the question they actually wanted answered. Here you got yourself some help out at the ranch, Purdy said, not looking up from his ledger. Word travels. Word always travels. Purdy did look up then. Folks say she's Apache, or something near it. Say she come out of Moreno's camp. Folks say a lot of things. This true, though. Roan set his money on the counter. Didn't answer. Purdy took the hint, mostly. Just territory's got opinions about that sort of thing, is all I'll say. Judge Whitlock's been talking up new ordinances. Settlement protection, he calls it. Whereas any native woman without a sponsoring family ought to be remanded to the reservation agency for her own safety. He said it careful, like he wasn't sure himself whether he believed it or was just repeating it. Man likes his ordinances. Likes them more since Moreno's crew started paying their tabs in coin. Nobody asks questions about. That last part caught Rowan's attention sharper than anything else Purdy had said. Moreno drinks in this town? Moreno does business in this town. Purdy lowered his voice, though there was no one else in the store to hear it. Him and the judge get on real friendly, is what I've noticed. For more friendly than a judge ought to get with a man like that, but that ain't my business, and it sure ain't yours, so I'd leave it be if I were you. Roan gathered his supplies without another word. But he carried the conversation with him the whole ride home, turning it over the way he'd learned to turn over everything lately. Purdy's careful voice, Drudge's new ordinances, true friendly arrangement between a man of law and a man who dealt in stolen women and stolen silver. Outside the courthouse, as he loaded his wagon, he caught sight of Judge Ezra Whitlock himself, a narrow, silver-haired man in a good coat, standing in close conversation with two riders whose faces Rowan didn't recognize, but whose horses he did. Lean, well-kept, expensive animals for men who didn't look like they'd done an honest day's labor in years. Same look Rourke Moreno's crew carried even from a distance. Rowan didn't think much of it in the moment, filed it away instead, the way he'd started filing away everything that didn't sit quite right. He rode home before dark, didn't mention the judge or Purdy's warning when Neva asked how the ride had gone. Told himself there was no reason to worry her over something that might turn out to be nothing. Should have told her anyway. For a peddler came through a week later, a thin, nervous man named Cobb, pushing a cart full of tin goods and needles and cheap tobacco, for the kind of travelling merchant who made his living knowing a little bit about everyone between here and the territorial line. For old Otis a new whetstone sold Frank a tin of tobacco. And when his eyes landed on Neva, for working the garden a short distance off, something in his face shifted recognition, for the memory of a rumour, Rowan couldn't quite tell which. "Rat the woman from Moreno's camp?" Cobb asked. Voice dropped low, like the question itself was worth money. "Careful," Rowan said. Cobb held up both hands, placating. "No offence meant, friend. Just words out is all. Moreno's been asking around 3 counties over, offering coin for anybody who can point him toward a ranch keeping an Apache woman. Good coin, too, more than a peddler sees in a months. You looking to collect? Me?" Rob laughed. "Too quick, too nervous to be entirely convincing." "No, sir. I know better than to get between a man and his business. Just thought you'd want to know somebody's paying for the information. Never can tell who might be tempted." His eyes flicked for a second toward the bunkhouse, toward the 3 hands finishing their morning chores. Rowan didn't miss it, filed it away, same as everything else lately. "Obliged for the warning," he said, and paid Cobb for a spool of wire he didn't especially need, mostly to be rid of him faster. The peddler moved on before noon, cart rattling off down the trail toward the next spread. Rowan stood a long while afterward, watching the dust settle, turning Cobb's careless glance toward the bunkhouse over and over in his mind. For he didn't say anything to Otis or Frank about it. Didn't quite know how to raise the subject without sounding like he was accusing men who'd worked this land for years of something they might not have done. He didn't say anything to Emmett either. Told himself again that it was probably nothing. Was starting to notice, though, for how often he'd been telling himself that lately, about how many different things. Back at the ranch, the days kept stacking up into something that had started, without either of them quite naming it, resemble a life. Neva took over the garden plot behind the cabin that had gone to weeds since the fire, and within weeks had it producing more than Rowan's late wife ever had squash and beans. Climbing a trellis, Neva built herself out of scrap wood for a row of the same bitter herbs she used in her broth, planted with a precision that told him gardening too, was something her mother had taught her, back before the world took that from her along with everything else. She started joining the men for branding season, and though Otis and Frank still kept a polite distance, they stopped flinching every time she walked past. Emmett remained harder to read. Polite, competent, always somewhere nearby when Neva was working alone, though Rowan told himself each time he noticed it that it meant nothing at all. Branding day came hard and hot, dust rising thick over the corral until the whole world smelled like scorched hide and sweat and the particular burnt copper smell of the iron itself. Rowan worked the chute. Otis and Frank handled the roping. Neva, to everyone's surprise but her own, turned out to have a steadier hand with the branding iron than any of them, holding it exactly long enough and not a second more, reading each animal's panic the same unhurried way she read tracks in the dirt. "You're better at this than Frank," Rowan said, wiping sweat from his brow during a break, watching her work the next calf into position. "Frank is afraid of hurting them. That's a bad thing?" "It is a good thing in a man. A bad thing in a rancher." She set the iron back in the fire to heat. "Pain that heals fast is kinder than pain that lingers, because a man could not commit to it. Where I come from, we just call that being tough." "Where I come from," she said, "we call it being honest." She glanced at him sideways, the closest thing to teasing he'd seen from her yet. Cowboys give simple things such complicated names. You Apache give simple things such complicated meanings. The word left his mouth easy enough this time. She met his eyes, steady iron, still warming in her hand. Chiricahua, she said. You are going to name us right. Chiricahua, he repeated, testing the shape of the word. Chiricahua Apache. There were Mescalero once, nearer the mountains. Western bands, further north still. Different fires. Different words, different history, however much your people prefer to fold us all into one blanket and call it done. A pause, and when she spoke again there was no anger in it, only a tired kind of patience. It is easier to hate one enemy than to learn the names of several neighbours, I have found. Didn't mean to lump you in with anybody. I know. She turned back to the fire, the iron glowing orange now in her hand. You are learning. Slower than I would like, but learning. What do your own people call themselves? Word for word, I mean. Not what the Spanish gave you, not what ended up in some soldier's report. She looked at him a long moment, weighing whether he meant the question or was only being polite. Another time she said, perhaps he let it go. He noticed, later that evening, she'd said perhaps, and not never, and he found himself turning that single word over in his mind longer than a word that Small had any right to occupy. By sundown the whole herd was branded, or the men bone-tired and satisfied in the particular way hard. Finished work leaves a body. Otis broke out a jug he'd been saving for the occasion, and even Neva took a small sip before making a face that had Frank laughing so hard he nearly fell off the fence rail. Roan thought later, lying awake on the cabin floor, listening to her breathing even out across the room, one of the best days he'd had in 3 years. He didn't examine too closely why that was. The evening it happened, the evening everything shifted, started ordinary enough. Neva was mending a bridle by the fire. Roan was cleaning his rifle, more out of habit than necessity. And somewhere in the quiet between them, she reached up to adjust the small carved bead she wore on a cord around her neck, something he'd noticed weeks ago but never properly looked at, and the firelight caught the symbol etched into its face. Circle. Broken on one side, a single line running through it like a river cutting through stone. His hands went still on the rifle. He knew that symbol, not from her people, not from anything she'd shown him or told him about her mother, her family, the world she'd lost. From a silver medallion. One that used to hang around his wife's neck, a gift from her own mother. The single thing he had never found after the raid, after everything that raid had taken from him, the one small piece of her that had simply vanished into that terrible night, along with almost every other reason he'd once had to keep living. Where'd you get that? He said. His voice came out wrong, too tight, too fast. Neva's hand went to the bead instinctively, protective, the way a person guards the last thing they have left. It was my mother's mark, passed down to daughters, that symbol. He was on his feet now, though he didn't remember standing, the rifle forgotten across his knees a second ago, and now lying in the dirt beside his boots. I've seen it before, many wear symbols like it, not like this, not exact like this. His pulse was loud in his own ears. Circle broken on the left side, ran straight through the middle. I've seen that exact mark, Neva, I'd know it anywhere. She studied his face, saw something there that made her go very still, the way she went still whenever danger was close. Where did you see it? He opened his mouth, closed it again. Because he didn't have a full answer yet, because it might mean nothing. A coincidence existed, didn't it? Even out here, even after everything. Except some part of him, the part that had never stopped grieving, the part that kept looking for her in every shadow and every stranger, and every symbol carved into wood or silver or stone, that part of him already knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof. It was not nothing. My wife, he said finally, the words dragging out of him like they cost something physical to speak. She wore a medallion, silver. That exact mark. Her mother gave it to her before we married. His throat tightened around the next part. It went missing the night she died. Along with her, along with how he couldn't finish it, hadn't finished that particular sentence out loud in 3 years, and wasn't about to manage it now, never didn't move, didn't reach for him. Watched him with an expression he couldn't fully read, grief, recognition, something darker starting to surface behind her eyes. Tell me what happened to her, she said quietly. All of it, please. He didn't know why he told her. Maybe because she'd already seen enough of his silence to have earned the truth. Maybe because some wound only stops festering once someone else finally looks at it directly. He told her the raid. The 5 days he'd been gone driving cattle to a buyer 3 towns over, the trust Paired placed in a ranch he thought was safe, the smoke he'd seen from 4 miles out, and the horse he'd nearly killed, getting home too late to do anything but bury what was left. Wife. His son, not yet 3 years old. Everything he'd built, gone in an afternoon he hadn't been present for, and had spent 3 years since unable to forgive himself for missing. When he finished, the fire had burned low, and neither of them had moved to build it back up. "I never found who did it," he said. "Searched for months. Territory's too big, too lawless, too many men with too many reasons to disappear. I gave up eventually, told myself I had to if I wanted to keep breathing." Neva's hand closed slowly around the bead at her throat. "Oh, I do not know who took your wife," she said carefully, "but I know men who wear marks like this because they took them off women who could no longer wear them. Trophies. Proof of what they'd taken." Her jaw tightened. Moreno collects such things. But the mark itself. Roan's voice was still unsteady. "How would my wife have come to wear the same mark as your mother, unless nothing so strange as you are imagining?" Neva shook her head slowly. "This mark is not only my family's, it travels. Traders carry it between peoples a ward against harm, or given as a gift of goodwill between our families and settlers, who dealt honestly with us, back before honest dealing became rare on both sides. My mother wore it because her mother gave it to her. Your wife may have worn it for the same reason. Any settler woman near the old trade routes might have a gift from someone who wished her well, passed down the same as mine was, with no blood between us at all." She held his gaze steady. "For it does not mean our families were connected. It means perhaps that your wife once stood close enough to my people to be given something meant as protection. Or that is all the mark can honestly tell us. The man wearing it now is what should frighten us both. The name hit him like it had the very first night, except heavier now, weighted with 3 years of buried searching." "Moreno," he said. "Rourke Moreno." He held his gaze, steady even through what he could see was her own private grief resurfacing. "He does not only take women, Roan, he takes whatever he believes will make him feel less small. Land. Livestock." A pause. Deliberate. "Lives." Neither of them said the rest out loud, or didn't need to. Something between them had shifted permanently in the space of that single conversation. No longer a stranger, sheltering a stranger. No longer an accident of storm and law neither of them had chosen. Something with roots now. Something with a shared wound at the center of it, whether either of them was ready for that or not. He barely slept that night. Up by the dying fire, turning the question over and over, trying and failing to make the pieces fit into something he could manage, until, sometime near dawn, a different sound cut through the dark. Not chains this time, hoofbeats, many of them, for coming fast and coming deliberate, the unhurried confidence of men who had done this before and expected to win. He was up before the thought finished forming. Rifle in hand, moving through the cabin door into grey pre-dawn light, where dust already hung thick from riders closing in from the east. 6 of them, maybe 7, fanning out around the ranch with practiced ease, men who knew exactly how to surround a place before its owner had even finished waking. Neva was beside him in the doorway a heartbeat later, and whatever fear he half expected to find on her face wasn't there. Cold, focused stillness, the same stillness she'd worn tied to that cottonwood weeks ago, a woman who had learned long before he ever met her exactly how to face the worst without flinching. "Moreno," she said. One word, all the explanation the moment needed. Rowan's grip tightened on the rifle. "You said that name before I even asked. He wants what he believes still belongs to him. Nothing here belongs to him." The riders slowed as they closed the distance, forming a loose half-circle at the edge of the yard, rifles resting easy across their saddle horns. In absolutely no hurry, the unhurried confidence of men who had never once lost a fight like this, and had no reason yet to believe today would be different. Fra Otis and Frank came out from the bunkhouse at the sound, both armed, both taking positions without needing to be told. For Emmett came out a half-beat slower than the other two. Roan noticed it, filed it away without understanding it yet, the way you notice a single wrong note in a familiar song. for one rider came ahead of the rest. Broad through the shoulders, hat pushed back off his forehead, a face that might have been handsome once before it hardened into something else entirely. And around his neck, catching the first thin light of morning, hung a silver medallion on a worn leather cord, the same symbol, the exact same mark. Roan's whole world went very quiet. "For morning," the man called out, almost friendly, the way a wolf might greet a lamb it had already decided to eat. Didn't mean to come calling so early. But my property wandered off some weeks back, and word travels. And I hear it's been keeping house with you, friend. "Don't see any property here," Roan said. "Just a ranch, mine." The man's eyes slid past Roan to Neva in the doorway, and something in his expression sharpened with interest. "There she is. Told the boys she'd land on her feet, that one." "Always does. Rourke Moreno," Neva said quietly. Cried Roan, not to him, but for him, so he'd have the whole name spoken clean once, for whatever came next. Rourke smiled at hearing his own name in her mouth, like it pleased him deeply. "She remembers me. That's downright sweet. Get off my land," Roan said. "Your land." Rourke's eyes dropped, slow and deliberate, through the medallion resting against his own chest, then lifted back to Roan's face, waiting for something with the patience of a man who already suspected he'd find it. Funny thing about property, friend. Sometimes a man doesn't even know what he's holding until somebody else recognizes it first. He touched the medallion, turned it once between two fingers, casual, like he was simply fidgeting. Roan's breath stopped dead in his chest, because he knew that gesture. Through that exact absent little turn of silver between two fingers, the same specific, refreshingly familiar habit his wife used to have when she was thinking, when she was nervous, or when she was happy. A habit so precisely hers that watching a stranger echo, it felt like the ground splitting open beneath his boots. "Where'd you get that medallion?" Roan said. "Very quiet now, very still." Rourke's smile widened, slow and terrible, like he'd been waiting the entire conversation for exactly this question. All thing, he turned it once more, let the silver catch the light. "Took it off a woman a few years back, out past the salt flats. Real pretty homestead, out there all alone, no neighbors for miles." He tilted his head, studying Roan's face, like a man reading a map he'd already memorized. "She fought harder than I expected, that one. Real shame what happened after. The world tilted underneath him." "No, that wasn't right. Couldn't be right." Because medallions got traded, didn't they? Got stolen and sold and stolen again, passed hand to hand through a territory full of thieves. And just because a symbol matched didn't mean. Except it wasn't just the symbol, it was the gesture. The exact turn of two fingers. A tick so small, so specifically his wife's, that no coincidence in the world could account for it. Which meant it wasn't chance at all. Which meant 3 years of searching, 3 years of dead ends and cold trails, and a grief he'd never once managed to close the door on, had just ridden up to his own front gate, wearing his answers around its neck like a bell. Because Roan already knew, had known the instant he first saw the medallion around this man's throat, some animal part of him had understood before his mind caught up, and hearing it confirmed out loud didn't feel like new information at all. Felt like a door he'd stood outside of for 3 years, finally swinging open on the room he'd never had the nerve to look inside. "You," Roan said. His voice didn't sound like his own anymore. "You were there. I was there for a lot of things, friend." Rourke's smile hadn't moved an inch. "World's a small place out here in the territory. Funny how it keeps bringing folks back together, given enough time." Behind Roan, Neva's hand found his arm, steadying, or warning. He couldn't tell which, and in that moment it didn't matter, because every part of him was already narrowing down to one single, burning point of focus. This man, this exact man, sitting easy in his saddle with the morning light behind him, wearing the last surviving piece of Roan's wife like a trophy, like a joke he'd been telling for years without an audience worth the punchline, until now. "Get off my land," Roan said again, and this time his voice didn't shake at all. Rourke laughed. Low, unbothered, the laugh of a man who had never once in his life been made to answer for anything he'd done. "We'll be back," he said, gathering his reins, turning his horse in an unhurried circle, absolutely no rush, because men like him never were, not when they held every card and knew it. "This ain't finished, Cowboy. Not the girl." His eyes flicked once more to Roan's white-knuckled grip on the rifle. And not whatever this is between you and me, now that we've finally been introduced properly. He rode off first. The others followed, rising gold in the growing light, hoofbeats, fading slow across the flats, until the desert finally swallowed the sound whole and the ranch went silent again. Silent in that particular way a place goes silent after violence has only just been postponed and not prevented. Otis lowered his rifle first, hands not quite steady. "Lord Almighty," he muttered mostly to himself. "That's the outfit that's been hitting the Callahan spread and the Doyle place both. Didn't figure they'd come this far north. France. They came for her," Frank said, nodding toward Neva, though there was no accusation in it any more, but only a kind of grim understanding. Or for him. He glanced at Roan. "Hard to say which, now." "Both," Roan said. "Reckon it's both now." Emmett said nothing at all, stood by the barn a moment longer than the others, watching the dust settle over the flats, where the riders had vanished before finally turning back to the morning chores like nothing unusual had happened. Roan noticed the delay, filed it away, same as always, without understanding yet what it meant. "We'll want more ammunition," Red, already thinking practical, the way old ranch hands did, when the alternative was thinking about how close they'd all just come to something much worse. Probably ought to ride the fence line twice a day now, instead of once. "Men like that don't warn you a second time." "I'll see to it," Roan said. The hands scattered back to their work, the ranch settling into its usual rhythms with the strange, stubborn resilience of any working place that has just survived a threat and has no choice but to keep moving forward regardless. Roan stood in the doorway a long time after they'd gone, rifle still raised, hands still shaking, though this time it had nothing to do with the cold and nothing at all to do with rain. Neva watched him. "Careful, quiet, waiting for him to be ready to be looked at. You knew him," she said finally. "Not a question." Roan lowered the rifle slowly, staring out at the empty flats where dust still hung faint in the morning air. "No," he said, "but I think I've been looking for him for 3 years without knowing his name." Behind them, near the barn, Emmett stood a moment too long before finally going back to work, and if Roan had looked, really looked, he might have noticed the way the man's eyes tracked the departing riders just a little too closely, a little too knowingly, for a hired hand who'd simply woken up to an unwelcome surprise like everyone else. Roan didn't look. Not yet. His whole world had narrowed down to a silver medallion and the man who wore it, and there wasn't room left in that moment for anything else. They sat together on the porch step, once the yard had gone quiet again, the sun fully up now, the desert bright and merciless and utterly unbothered by what had almost happened beneath it. "You should have told me," Neva said. "Not angry, just certain. About your wife. About what you have been carrying, before I made you say it out loud in front of a man like Rourke Moreno. Wasn't planning on saying it at all, I know." She looked at him steadily. "That is the problem with you, Cowboy. You plan to carry everything alone, and then you are surprised when it becomes too heavy to hide." He almost laughed. "Didn't quite have it in him yet. That how your people do it? Say everything out loud first chance you get?" "No." A small, humorless smile. "My people bury grief the same as yours. We simply do not pretend the grave is empty." She looked out towards the flats where the dust had finally settled. "He will come back. You understand this? I understand it. Next time he will not come to talk." "I know that too." She was quiet a moment, turning something over the way she always did before she spoke it. "Then we should decide, before he returns, what we are willing to become to stop him." Roan looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite let himself since the storm, and saw not the stranger he'd carried in out of the rain 2 months ago, but something else now, someone standing beside him instead of merely sheltered by him, someone with her own reasons, her own grief, her own unfinished war, with the same man who had taken everything from them both. "Whatever it takes," he said. He held out her hand between them. Not the gesture of a wife claiming a husband by law, something plainer than that. Something closer to an equal offering a hand to another equal, both of them standing at the edge of the same fight now, for reasons that had stopped being separate the moment a silver medallion caught the morning light. He took it. because that was the terrible shape of it now, wasn't it? The collar he'd broken off a stranger's throat in a storm had led him, one careful step at a time, for without either of them ever consciously choosing it, straight back to the man who had broken everything Roan once had, and there was no walking away from that. Not now, not ever, if he had anything to say about how the rest of this played out. The desert lay quiet under the climbing morning sun, indifferent as always to whatever had just been set irreversibly into motion. But Rowan Hargrove stood in his own doorway, with his dead wife's medallion burned permanently into his memory, and Neva stood beside him, with her mother's matching mark cool against her collarbone, and neither of them said the word out loud yet, for neither of them needed to. Whatever this had started as an accident, a law neither of them had asked for, a stranger pulled off a tree in the pouring rain, it wasn't that any more. It hadn't been, maybe, for a while now, for if either of them had been honest enough to admit it, was something else entirely now. Something with roots reaching back 3 long years, and a debt that had just ridden up to their front door and introduced itself by name. Smile. Crike it had all the time in the world to collect, for the dust from Moreno's riders had barely settled before the next danger arrived. Because that was the shape of things now. One threat never left before another one was already saddling up. Roan couldn't sleep the night before it happened. Lay awake on the cabin floor, staring at the rafters, some old rancher's instinct nagging at the edge of his mind that he couldn't quite name. Too quiet outside. No coyotes, no owls working the fence line. Stillness that felt less like peace and more like the whole desert was holding its breath alongside him. He almost woke Neva to say something about it. Almost. Except what would he even say? Something feels wrong. Can't tell you what. Foolish even inside his own head. So he kept it there, France, and told himself he was being jumpy after everything that had already happened, and eventually drifted into a thin, uneasy sleep. For it came at night, 3 days after the standoff at the gate. No warning this time, no speeches, no medallion turned slow between 2 fingers, no unhurried smile, just gunfire, sudden and close, tearing through the dark while the ranch slept. Roan was out of bed before he was fully awake, rifle in hand, moving on instinct alone. 2 shapes at the horse corral, cutting the rope line, trying to scatter the stock before anyone could stop them. Standard tactic, leave a man afoot and you'd already half beaten him. He fired once, missed, fired again. 1 shape dropped, run, returned fire blind into the dark, and Roan felt the burn along his upper arm a half second before he understood what it meant. Hot, then cold, then hot again, spreading. He'd been shot before. Once, years back, breaking a horse that had other plans. It was different. This had intention behind it. The second rider fled into the scrub before Otis or Frank could get a clean shot. Hoofbeats fading fast into the dark, the same way Moreno's men always seemed to fade, like the desert itself was in on the arrangement. Roan stood there a moment, breathing hard, arm throbbing, watching the dust settle over a dead horse thief and an empty stretch of night. Then his knees told him it was time to sit down, whether he'd decided to or not. He came to on the cabin floor with Neva's hands already working, cutting his sleeve away with quick, economical movements. Her face close enough that he could see the fear. She wasn't letting reach her voice. Hold still. Holding, you are not trying. He pressed a folded cloth hard against the wound, and he hissed through his teeth. For a moment the room narrowed down to just that pressure, pain, her hands steady even when her jaw wasn't. Runt went through, she said, checking the exit. That is good. That is the only good thing about tonight. Feels real good from here. Do not make jokes. Somebody's got her. Not you. Not now. Her voice cracked, slightly, right at the edge, Fran, and he understood then how frightened she'd actually been, underneath all that steadiness. For I have already buried a family, Cowboy. I am not doing it twice in one lifetime. That silenced him more than the pain had. France. She cleaned the wound with something that burned worse than the bullet had, from paste of crushed leaves and ground root that smelled sharp and bitter, and packed it tight with clean cloth. Through all of it, her hands never once shook, though he could feel faintly tremor still running underneath her calm. Where'd you learn this? He asked, mostly to keep his mind off the pain, though he was genuinely curious too. for my mother, and my mother's mother before her. It was our family's place among our people. Not warriors, not chiefs. She tied off the last binding, careful, precise. Healers. That why you knew how to fix your own legs so well back when I found you. That is why I am alive at all. Bree sat back on her heels, finally letting some of the tension leave her shoulders now that the worst of work was done. A healer who cannot heal herself is not much of a healer. 4. He watched her in the firelight's steady hands, tired eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd just spent everything she had keeping another person alive. Thank you, he said. Simple, direct. You are welcome. A pause, though I would prefer in the future that you simply avoid being shot. It is easier on both of us. I'll take it under consideration. See that you do. Slept hard that night. The kind of sleep that comes only after real pain finally lets go its grip. And when he woke past noon the next day, stiff and sore but alive, for he found Neva asleep in the chair beside the bed, chin dropped to her chest, for having clearly kept watch long past any reasonable hour. He didn't wake her. Fror just lay there a while, watching her sleep, feeling something shift in his chest that he wasn't ready to name yet. Because somewhere in these past 4 months, without him fully noticing when it happened, this had stopped being a stranger's presence in his cabin. Fror had become something else. He wasn't sure yet what to call it, wasn't sure he was ready to find out. Finally stirred once she woke on her own, blinking, oriented, the particular embarrassment of someone caught, having cared more than they meant to let show. You should have woken me, Bree said, straightening quickly. Smoothing her hair back like that might undo the evidence of having fallen asleep at his bedside at all. Didn't see the harm in letting you rest. I was supposed to be watching you. 4. Not sleeping beside you like some... She stopped herself, colour rising in her face, unable to finish the sentence. Like some what? Nothing. Too quick. It does not matter. Didn't peg you for someone who leaves sentences unfinished. I do not, usually. Bree busied herself checking his bandage, avoiding his eyes with a focus that told him more than the words themselves would have. You are healing well. Wound is clean. Neva. What? Thank you for sitting up with me. He caught her hand before she could pull it away, gentle, giving her every chance to refuse the contact if she wanted to. Didn't have to do that either, same as everything else. Bree let her hand stay in his a moment longer than strictly necessary before finally easing it back. Though something in her expression had softened, the careful embarrassment giving way to something quieter and more honest. You are welcome, she said. Try not to require it again so soon. I'll do my best, she said. Standing to fetch him water has proven fairly unreliable so far, Cowboy. But I appreciate the attempt. The warriors arrived 4 days later, while his arm was still bound tight and aching with every movement. Saw them first, riding in slow from the east ridge at dawn, for a dozen strong, no rush to their approach, for no attempt at concealment either. Brought raiders, something else, something with ceremony behind it. Company, Otis called out, and something in his voice told Roan this wasn't the kind of company you met with a rifle raised. Neva was already outside when Roan reached the porch, standing very still, one hand pressed flat against her own chest like she was holding something in. Who are they? Roan asked. My people. Her voice had gone strange, tight. Something between hope and dread that he'd never heard from her before, not even during the Moreno standoff. Or what is left of them. The riders drew up at the edge of the yard, dismounted with quiet formality, and the man at their front, older grey, threading through dark hair, a face carved by decades of hard weather and harder decisions, stepped forward alone. Or went rigid beside Rowan. Bran, she breathed. Just the name, nothing else. But everything in the way she said it told Roan this was not a stranger. Roan took the moment to study the rest of them while Neva stood frozen beside him, 12 riders in all. Weathered leather, worn rifles, the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have survived on very little for a very long time, not raiders, not soldiers either. Something older than both, something with its own laws and its own grief, carried the way, never carried hers close to the chest, rarely shown, for never forgotten. For one of the younger warriors caught Roan looking and held his gaze unflinching, sizing him up the same unhurried way Ran had. Roan didn't look away first. Some instinct told him that mattered here more than anything he might have said. For one long moment nobody moved. 4. then Neva crossed the yard faster than her still healing leg should have allowed, and threw her arms around the older man like she was trying to make sure he was real. "You are alive," he said, fought into his shoulder, voice breaking in a way Rowan had never once heard it break. "For I thought, after the raid, I thought everyone what you thought." Ran's voice was low, careful, something in it that didn't quite match the warmth of the embrace. "I let you think it, for a long time. I am sorry for that." Neva pulled back, studying his face, searching for something. "Why would you let me think you were dead?" Ran's eyes moved past her briefly to Rowan standing on the porch, then back to her. "Because the truth was harder to say than a lie," he said quietly. "And because I did not know, until word reached us weeks ago, that you were even alive to hear it." Spoke that afternoon. France, and for all of them together, France, in the shade of the barn, the warriors keeping a respectful distance, while Ran sat across from Rowan and Neva both. "Travels fast, even in a territory this large," Ran said. "A woman freed from Moreno's camp, a cowboy who removed her collar and did not send her away." His eyes studied Rowan with open assessment. "We came to see for ourselves what kind of man does that." "Wasn't looking to prove anything," Rowan said. "Just did what seemed right. That is precisely the kind of answer we needed to hear." Ran almost smiled. Almost. "But hearing is not the same as knowing. Our law requires more than words, Cowboy. It requires proof." "What kind of proof?" "You will hunt with us. 3 days. You will show us you can protect what you have claimed responsibility for, not merely speak of protecting it." Ran's gaze flicked toward Neva, "And in your absence she will show us she does not need protecting nearly as much as either of you seem to believe." Neva's chin lifted at that. "I do not need 3 days to prove that. I have already proven it more than once." 3 days will cost you nothing," Ran said. "Except perhaps his company, which I understand you have grown fond of." Face flushed, and Rowan felt something warm move through his own chest despite the tension of the moment, and for just a second, before duty and danger crowded back in, it almost felt like an ordinary conversation between ordinary people. France. That evening, before the fires were lit and the warriors settled into the small camp they'd made near the barn, Rowan found himself alone with one of the older women who'd ridden in with the group, silent until now, watching everything with sharp, careful eyes. "You do not know what you have taken into your home," he said, without preamble, rattling onto an overturned crate near the fire pit. "Do you, Cowboy?" "Been trying to learn. Trying is good. It is not enough." She studied him a long moment. "Do you know what it means among our people for a woman to be born into a healing line?" Neva mentioned her mother taught her, didn't say much beyond that. She would not. It is not something spoken of carelessly. The woman's eyes drifted toward Neva, deep in quiet conversation with Ran across the yard. "There have been 3 such lines among our people for as long as anyone remembers. 3 families who carry the old knowledge, the plants, for the wounds, fevers, births, the deaths. When the soldiers came for our grazing land, when the raid scattered what was left of us across 100 miles of desert, 2 of those 3 lines ended completely. Every carrier gone." Rowan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And the third is standing in your yard, Cowboy, wearing your dead wife's dress underneath her own deerskin, because you offered it to her out of kindness, and she refused it out of pride." The old woman's gaze sharpened. "Neva Kaya is not simply a woman you found tied to a tree. She is the last carrier of knowledge that took 3 generations to build, and cannot be rebuilt in a single lifetime if it is lost now. Every remaining family among our scattered people looks to her, whether she has accepted that weight or not, as the last thread connecting us to who we were before everything was taken. She never said any of that." "She would not," the woman said again, gentler this time. "For it is a heavy thing to carry, being the last of something, heavier still to speak of it aloud, as though saying it might make the loss more real than it already is." She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "I tell you this not to frighten you, Cowboy. I tell you because a man who understands what he is protecting protects it differently than a man who does not. One more thing," she said, "since you have earned the honesty tonight." Something almost like amusement crossed her weathered face. "That law she gave you the night of the storm, the collar, the claim. Do not go believing that is carved into every Chiricahua fire the way your people carve laws into books. Rot. Then whose law is it? Hers, her mother's, and her mother's mother's, before that a teaching passed down inside that one healing line about what it means to take responsibility for a life you have touched with your own hands. For other families among our people would have released you from any such claim the moment you asked it plainly. Hers would not, because her line has always measured a person by what they were willing to carry, not merely by what they were willing to say. He studied him with new interest, head tilted. You did not know that, and yet you carried her anyway, law or no law. That tells me something too, Cowboy. She left him there by the fire, turning the weight of it over in his mind long after she'd gone, understanding for the first time just how much larger this had all become than a stranger, a storm, and a law neither of them had asked for. The warriors shared a meal with the household. That first evening, a gesture Otis later admitted he hadn't expected and didn't entirely know how to receive, though he managed well enough once Neva showed him where to sit and how to accept the offered plate without giving offense. Food was simple. Roasted meat, wild green, flatbread cooked over the open fire that Neva made with quick, practiced hands, same recipe, he explained. Her mother had made for every gathering of consequence, for as long as she could remember. You never made this for us, Roan said, watching her work, the dough with an ease that told him this wasn't a skill she'd let go rusty, for even after everything. You never asked, didn't know to ask, now you know. She handed him a piece, still warm, and watched him take a bite with something close to satisfaction when his face changed at the taste. For it is better shared with many people. That is part of what makes it what it is. It was never meant to be cooked for one man alone in a quiet cabin. Round the fire, warriors traded stories in low voices, Bram in their own language, Bram in careful English, offered for Rowan's benefit. Rowan found himself listening more than talking, learning names, faces, small fragments of a whole people's history he'd never once thought to ask about before. Neva walked into his life. One young woman, older than 60, worked up the courage to ask Neva directly about the healing lineage, her voice hesitant with a kind of reverence that made Neva visibly uncomfortable. "Will you teach it?" the girl asked to someone else. "Now that you are found again." Neva was quiet. A long moment, the fire crackling in the space where an answer should have been. "For I do not know yet," she said finally. "I have spent so long simply surviving that I have not had room to think past it. But I promise you this, the knowledge will not die with me. I owe that much to my mother, and to everyone who did not survive to pass anything on at all." The girl nodded, gratified, and the conversation moved on to lighter things. But Rowan noticed the weight that had settled briefly over Neva's face, gone now but not forgotten, for one more piece of the burden Ran's companion had described to him earlier that same evening. Later, once the fire had burned low and most of the camp had settled towards sleep, Fran sat alone a while, watching Neva across the dying flames with an expression Rowan was beginning to recognize all too well: pride, and grief, and something else underneath both that hadn't yet found its way to the surface. Rowan didn't ask about it that night either. Some things he was learning couldn't be rushed toward the light. They came when they were ready, or they didn't come at all, and a man could only wait so patiently before the waiting itself became its own kind of danger. That night, Rowan found Neva sitting alone by the corral fence, staring out at nothing, her arms wrapped around her knees, in a way that made her look younger than her 24 years, younger than the iron and steel she usually carried herself with. "All right?" he asked, easing himself down, mindful of his arm. "I do not know. That's not like you, no," she agreed. "It is not. A long son. I spent 3 years believing my whole family was gone, my mother, my father, my brothers, and Ran I mourned hardest of all, because he was the one who taught me everything, before everything was taken." Her hands tightened around her own knees. "Finding out he is alive should feel like the answer to every prayer I stopped believing would be answered, but it does not feel entirely like relief." She looked at him, something troubled moving behind her eyes. "There is something in the way he looks at me, something careful, guilty almost." She shook her head, like she was trying to shake the thought loose. "I am probably imagining it. Grief makes people see shadows where there is only light. Rowan didn't answer right away, because he'd noticed it too. That same careful guilt in the older man's eyes. Every time he looked at Neva when he thought no one else was watching, he didn't say so. Not yet. Didn't want to hand her a shadow to chase before she was ready to go looking for it herself. Maybe it's just been a long few years, he said instead. For everybody, she let that stand, though he could tell, even in the dark, that she didn't quite believe it either. She confronted Ran about it the very next evening, catching him alone near the horses while the rest of the camp settled towards sleep. Flinch, he said, for, without preamble, every time I say your name. For I have watched you do it for days now. I want to know why. Ran didn't answer immediately, just kept brushing down his horse, hands steady even as something in his shoulders tightened visibly. It is not the right time for that conversation, he said finally. You keep saying that, for every day it is not the right time. I am starting to wonder if there will ever be a right time, or if you are simply hoping I forget to ask. I am not hoping that. Then what are you hoping for? He set the brush down, turned to face her fully for the first time since the question had been raised, and whatever she saw in his expression made her go very still. I'm hoping, read quietly, that when the truth finally comes, for you will remember that I loved your father more than my own life, and that everything I have ever done, for even the things I am most ashamed of, I did, because I did not know how else to keep what remained of our family alive. That does not sound like the beginning of a comfort, Ran. It sounds like the beginning of a confession. Perhaps it is both. Tell me. Now. Not yet. Voice cracked, just slightly, the first real crack she had ever heard in it. I am asking you for a little more time. Not because I do not trust you with the truth. Because I do not yet trust myself to say it without breaking something between us that has only just been given back to me. She studied him a long moment, torn between the fear coiling tighter in her chest and the love she still carried for the man who had taught her to track deer before she was old enough to hold a full-sized bow. Do not make me wait too long, she said finally. I have had enough of my life decided by other people's timing. I know. His eyes were wet, though he blinked it back before it could fall. I am sorry, Nivakaya, for more than you yet understand. She left him there among the horses, his apology hanging unfinished in the cold night air, and carried the weight of it back to the cabin without telling Rowan a single word of what had passed between them. Not yet, truths. She was learning. For needed to be carried alone a while before they could be shared with anyone else. Even a man she was beginning to trust with almost everything. He left with the warriors 2 mornings later, arms still stiff, but healed enough to manage a rifle if it came to that, and the 3 days that followed tested him in ways he hadn't expected. Not just the hunting, though, that alone would have humbled most men, tracking game across country that gave up nothing easily, for under the watchful, silent judgment of a dozen warriors who'd been doing this since before Rowan was born. First day tested his patience more than anything. Hours spent motionless at a water seep, waiting for deer sign that never came, while the warriors around him seemed entirely unbothered by the wasted time, as though patience itself were the point of the exercise rather than the game they claimed to be hunting. You keep checking the sun, Ran observed, crouched beside him in the brush. Like it owes you an explanation for moving slowly. Didn't realize I was doing it. Most men do not. It is why most men make poor hunters and poorer husbands. A pause, dry enough to almost be humour. Both require patience with things that refuse to move on your schedule. By the second day, the hunting gave way to something harder. For a rock face that needed climbing. For game. But simply because Ran pointed at it and said the view from the top would tell them something useful. Rowan understood, halfway up with his still healing arm screaming protest, that the climb itself was the test, not whatever waited at the summit. He made it. Barely, stood at the top with his lungs burning and his arm throbbing, looking out over a stretch of desert so vast. It made a man feel appropriately small, and found Ran watching him with something that might have been approval. Your arm should not have managed that climb, Ran said. Wasn't going to let it stop me. That is the difference, Cowboy, between a man who protects out of obligation and a man who protects because the alternative is unthinkable to him. Ran looked out at the horizon, something distant in his expression. I am beginning to believe you belong to the second kind. It has taken me some convincing. What would have convinced you otherwise? Ron didn't answer right away. Watched the horizon a while longer. Roan noticed, the first time, that same careful guilt moving behind the older man's eyes, for quick and gone before it could be examined too closely. Nothing, Ron said finally. I suppose nothing would have. I think I simply needed to see it for myself before I could forgive myself for a mistake I made a long time ago, involving a debt I am still trying to repay. For Roan filed that away too, alongside everything else he hadn't yet found the right moment to ask about directly. On the third night, for a mountain lion found their camp before they found it. And for a handful of violent seconds, the test stopped being philosophical and became entirely physical. Roan throwing himself between the cat and the nearest warrior on pure reflex, catching a raking claw across his forearm before the animal broke off and vanished into the dark, driven away more by the sudden chaos of firelight and shouting than by any single shot fired. He sat afterward, breathing hard, blood running warm down his arm again, and found the young warrior from the first night's conversation kneeling beside him, for binding the wound with quick, practiced hands. You did not have to do that, the young man said. Didn't think about it. Just did it. That is exactly why you did not have to. The young man tied off the binding, sat back, studied Roan with new eyes. For my grandmother used to say a man reveals himself fastest in the half-second before he has time to decide who he wants to be seen as. You revealed yourself tonight, Cowboy. I do not think you meant to. Roan didn't have an answer for that. Nodded, tired, arm aching in two places now instead of one, and let the fire burn down while the desert settled back into its uneasy peace around them. Ron came to sit beside him once the camp had mostly settled, studying the fresh binding on Roan's arm with an expression that had shifted noticeably since the climb 2 days before. You could have let him take the fall, Ron said quietly. The young one, would have been the safer choice. No one would have blamed you for hesitating half a second, weighing your own safety first. Didn't cross my mind to hesitate. Precisely what concerns me, and precisely what settles something I have been turning over since the day you rode into your own yard 4 months ago. Ron stared into the fire a long while before continuing. I lost people once, Cowboy, because I hesitated. Weighed my own safety and the safety of those I loved most against a choice that should never have required weighing at all. I have carried that hesitation every day since, like a stone I cannot set down. His voice dropped lower, rougher. Watching you throw yourself in front of a blade without a single second of that same hesitation, it does not undo what I did. But it tells me, at least, that Nivakaya has found herself a different kind of man than the one who failed her family the first time. Roan didn't fully understand what the older man meant. Not yet, though the weight of the confession pressed close enough to feel significant even without full context. Whatever you're carrying, Roan said carefully, sounds like it's past time you set it down. For your sake as much as hers, soon, Ron said. Promise you that much, even if I cannot yet promise the day. He said nothing further, and the fire burned low between them, two men from entirely different worlds sitting in the same uneasy silence, for each carrying grief the other could only partly guess at. It was the questions, more than the trials of body, that stayed with him longest. Asked sideways, over cook-fires at night, disguised as idle conversation, but never actually idle. You buried a wife, for one of the younger warriors said, on the second night, brought unkindly. Son, I did, and now you shelter another man's daughter, or another people's healer. The young man's eyes were sharp in the firelight. Some might say you are simply replacing what you lost, using her to fill a grave that should stay filled with the ones who belong there. For Roan felt that land somewhere deep and uncomfortable, closer to a truth he hadn't examined too carefully himself. Maybe there's some of that in me, he admitted, because lying to men who could read tracks from a mile off felt like a losing game. Wouldn't be human if there wasn't. But that's not the whole of it, not anymore. He stared into the fire, working the rest of the thought loose. She's not replacing anybody. She's just herself. Been herself since the night I found her tied to that tree. Took me a while to see that clear, but I see it now. The young man studied him a long moment. Ren nodded. Once, like Roan, had passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. For an older warrior across the fire, silent until now, spoke up next, voice rough with age and old smoke. who have buried a son. Do you fear, Cowboy? For that we would ask you to give another child to this land some day. For knowing what the desert has already taken from you once. Question hit harder than Rowan expected. He was quiet a long moment before answering. Won't lie and say the thought doesn't scare me some, he said finally, but fear's never been a good enough reason to stop living. Learned that the hard way. A man who lets fear make all his choices for him ends up with a life smaller than the one he was given to start with. A wise answer, the old man said, or a well-practiced one, I have not yet decided which. Reckon you'll have 3 days to figure it out. For that earned a low chuckle around the fire, even from the old man himself. And something in the tension of the group eased, just slightly, the way tension always eased once a stranger proved himself willing to be tested honestly rather than simply agreeable. Ran, sitting a little apart from the fire, said nothing at all. Watched Rowan with that same careful, guilty weight behind his eyes, and Rowan found himself wondering, the first time, for what exactly the older man was carrying that he hadn't put down yet. Back at the ranch, alone for the first time since the storm, Neva did not sit idle. She used the days to walk the fence lines herself, checking every weak point, every place a man on horseback might find easy passage. She spoke with Otis and Frank about watch rotations, about signal, fires, about the particular silence that comes right before trouble, rather than during it. She did not speak with Emmett about any of it. Not because she'd decided anything definite yet, just a feeling, small and persistent, that she couldn't quite explain even to herself. The way he watched the horizon a beat too long. The way his questions about the ranch's defenses always seemed to circle back around to specifics, how many rifles, how much ammunition, which nights the watch ran thinnest. She kept her suspicions to herself, for now, filed them away the way Rowan had been filing away his own, though neither of them yet knew the other was keeping the same quiet list. On the second morning of the men's absence, one of the warriors who had stayed behind to help guard the ranch took a bad fall from his horse near the eastern ridge. His leg bent wrong beneath him, face gone grey with pain by the time Otis got him back to the yard. Neva was at his side before Otis had even finished calling for help. He worked with a calm that startled even the warriors who had known her since childhood, setting the bone with quick, sure hands, packing the break with splints cut from mesquite branches, murmuring low words in her own language the whole time, words the injured man seemed to draw comfort from even through the pain. You have not lost the touch, the old woman from the fireside conversation observed, watching from a respectful distance. Your mother would be proud, watching you work. My mother would tell me I am too slow with the splinting. Prince, without looking up, Franz never pausing. She always said speed mattered as much as care. A wound does not wait politely while the healer perfects her technique. Your mother was harder on you than any of us ever were. My mother knew what I would need to survive. Reva finished the binding, sat back, checked the warrior's pulse at his wrist with practiced fingers. She was not wrong to be hard. Softness would have gotten me killed a dozen times over in Moreno's camp. The old woman said nothing to that. Watched Neva work. Something like grief and pride tangled together behind her eyes. The particular expression of someone watching a young person carry a weight she wished, more than anything, they had never been asked to carry at all. By evening the injured warrior was resting easy, fever nowhere in sight, the break set clean enough that Neva predicted a full recovery within 6 weeks if he kept off it properly. Saved his leg, Fred, still faintly amazed by the whole display. Days after he'd first watched her face down 2 wolves, barehanded. For maybe his life. I did my work. She wiped her hands clean, tired now that the adrenaline had worn off. It is what I was made for, Otis. Whether I asked for the making or not, the attack came on the second night of Rowan's absence. Full force of Moreno's crew, a smaller group. Probably. The way wolves test a fence line before committing to a real assault looking for the gap, the weak point, the moment when a place seemed most vulnerable. Reva had felt it coming before she heard it. Some old instinct sharpened by months in Moreno's camp that told her danger had a particular texture in the air before it ever announced itself with sound. She'd lain awake that evening turning it over. Except turning it over wasn't the same as knowing, and knowing wasn't the same as being ready. Or until the sound finally came, and there was no more time left for wondering, they found Neva instead. He heard them before Otis or Frank did, some instinct honed by years of listening for exactly this kind of danger, and she was already moving through the dark with a rifle in one hand and a knife at her belt before the first shot ever rang out. Her mind moved fast, faster than her feet even, cataloguing everything at once. 3 riders, coming fast along the eastern fence line, the same weak stretch she'd noted, and reinforced with fresh wire only 2 days before. 4, which meant someone had told them exactly where to look, which meant Emmett, though she didn't have proof yet, only the same cold certainty she'd been carrying for weeks. Because there was no other explanation. 4. Except there was always another explanation, wasn't there, and she couldn't afford the luxury of chasing it right now. She didn't wait for them to reach the yard. She met them at the fence itself. 4, using the terrain the way her mother had taught her, a shallow wash for cover, strand of mesquite for concealment, for the particular knowledge of ground that came from having walked every inch of it herself while the men were away. For her heart was hammering. She let it hammer. Fear was only useful if you let it move through you instead of freezing you in place, her mother used to say, and she'd never fully understood the lesson until nights exactly like this one. First rider went down when his horse, spooked by a sound Neva made deliberately from the brush, threw him hard against a fence post. The second she met with the rifle, one clean shot that took him out of the saddle before he'd even located where the danger was coming from. Bird turned to run. She let him go. Wounding a fleeing man risked nothing but wasted ammunition and the chance he had circle back once he understood the odds had shifted. For by the time Otis and Frank reached the fence line, for weapons drawn, breathing hard, frowned Neva, standing over the wreckage of the attempted raid, for blood on her hands that wasn't her own, utterly unshaken. Otis said, staring at the scene with something like awe. Remind me never to make you angry. For I am not angry, Prince. Checking the fence for damage with brisk efficiency, for already moving on to the next practical concern. For I am simply prepared. There is a difference. Roan returned 2 days later to find the fence mended, Fran for the yard quiet, Franiva standing on the porch in the fading evening light, rifle resting easy across her arm, looking for all the world like she'd been born to guard exactly this piece of ground. For he rode in slow, for taking in the sight of her steady, Fran's for unbroken, same stillness she'd worn, tied to that cottonwood months ago. Except now it belonged entirely to her, chosen rather than forced upon her. He dismounted, crossed the yard, stopped in front of her, close enough to see the exhaustion she was hiding beneath the calm. Heard there was trouble, he said. There was. You're all right. I am all right. A pause, something softer moving behind her eyes now that the danger had passed and the adrenaline had finally worn thin. You are all right too. That is the part I was less certain of these past 3 days. Ran's men are thorough. Kept me plenty busy. Didn't have much room left to get myself killed. Good, just that. One word carrying more weight than a longer sentence ever could have. He looked at her a long moment. Really looked. Not the stranger from the storm. Not even the woman he'd nursed back to health, or argued with over dresses and marriage law, or taught to sit a saddle while she taught him to read the ground beneath his own boots. Someone else now. Someone who had stood alone against 3 armed men, and never once faltered, because this ground, branch, fragile, for complicated arrangement between them, for had become something worth defending on her own terms. For Nevakaya, he said. Her breath caught visibly at the sound of her full name in his mouth. You remember that? Ran mentioned it during the hunt. Said it was the name your mother gave you at birth, before the world shortened everything about you down to something easier to say. He held her gaze steady. Didn't seem right calling you anything less than what you actually are. Something in her face broke open, just slightly, in a way he'd never seen before. Not fear, grief, brought the careful armor she wore against the world. Something closer to being truly seen for the first time in longer than she probably wanted to admit. No one has called me that, she said quietly. Since my mother died, then I'm honored to be the second. Stood there a long moment, for close enough now that neither of them stepped back, for the evening settling golden quiet around them, And something between them shifted permanently, the way ground shifts after an earthquake, settling into a new shape that could never quite go back to what it had been before. Supper that night carried a lightness the ranch hadn't felt in weeks. The whole household gathered around the fire outside Otis, Frank, for a handful of the warriors who'd stayed on to escort Ran back through dangerous country in a few days' time. Heard you fought off a mountain lion, Frank said to Roan, grinning around a mouthful of stew. That true? Or did the story grow some extra teeth on the ride home? Might have grown a little. Or might have, Neva agreed, deadpan. Grown considerably. Threw myself in front of a young man to keep him from getting mauled, Roan protested. That part's true. Whatever else got exaggerated. The claw marks are true, Neva said, examining the bandage on his forearm with mock professional interest. The rest, I suspect, has already become a much larger animal in the retelling than the one that actually attacked you. You weren't there. I do not need to have been there. I know how cowboys tell stories. She glanced at Otis, who grinned and raised his cup in cheerful agreement. By the time this reaches town, it will be a bear. By next season, a grizzly twice the size of any that has ever lived in this territory. For the whole fire erupted in laughter, Frank nearly choking on his stew, and Roan found himself laughing along despite the mild indignity of it. Because watching her tease him in front of the whole ranch, easy and unguarded, felt like its own kind of victory after everything the last few weeks had cost them both. All you want, he said, once the noise had settled. Man nearly loses an arm defending the honor of this outfit. Least you people could do is show some respect. We show respect, Otis said solemnly, by making sure the story stays honest. Wouldn't be respectful otherwise. Respect, that's mockery with extra steps. Same thing. Out here, Frank said. Fire erupted again. For one full evening, priest, the weight of everything circling the ranch felt distant enough to set down for a while. Truth about Emmett came out 3 days after that, and it came out ugly, for it had been building longer than any of them wanted to admit. Trevor had noticed it first, weeks back, though she'd said nothing, not even to Roan, the way Emmett's questions about the ranch always circled back to specifics that had no honest reason to matter to a hired hand. How many rifles? Which nights the watch ran thinnest, whether Roan planned to be away from the property any time soon. Small things, easy to dismiss one at a time, harder to dismiss once she'd started counting them. Frank found him first, near the tree line at the edge of the property, for deep in conversation with a rider Frank didn't recognize, but whose horse he did the same lean, well-kept animal he'd seen among Moreno's crew during the standoff weeks before. Frank had gone out that evening for no better reason than a restless feeling he couldn't name, the same kind of feeling that had kept Roan awake the night before the corral raid. He'd told himself he was being foolish, walking the tree line at dusk for nothing. Except something had drawn him out there anyway, and some part of him understood. Walking back toward the voices, foolish feelings out here had a way of turning out to be exactly right. He didn't confront him, had the sense to hang back to watch to see money change hands before the rider disappeared back into the scrub, the way Moreno's men always seemed to. He brought it straight to Roan the moment he returned. The confrontation happened at dusk, in the yard, with Otis and Frank flanking Roan and Neva standing a step behind, rifle in hand, watching Emmett's face carefully for the exact moment his composure finally cracked. Frank saw you, Roan said. No preamble, no room for pretending this was about anything else. Taking money from one of Moreno's riders, Emmett's jaw tightened. For a moment, Roan thought he might actually try to deny it. Started small, Frank said instead, flat, rind, or like a man who'd been waiting a long time for this exact conversation to finally happen. Told them when the watch ran thin. Told them how many rifles you kept in the house. Didn't think it would come to more than that. You told them about her. Roan's voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. Didn't you? That first week. Before you'd even worked here 2 months. For I needed the money. Hargrove. For the first time, something like shame crossed Emmett's face. My sister's got 4 kids and a husband who don't work, and Moreno's coin spends the same as anybody's, whether a man's proud of earning it or not. Coin bought with somebody else's blood. I know that. Emmett's voice cracked. "I know it better than you think. For every night since, I've known it." Neva stepped forward, rifle steady, eyes hard. "Your sister's children," she said. "Would they be proud of what fed them?" Emmett had no answer for that. Stood there, shoulders bowed, a man finally facing the full weight of a debt he'd been avoiding for months. They didn't kill him. Rowan considered it. Cold, furious moment right after the truth came out. Considered it seriously enough to frighten himself a little. But Neva's hand found his arm before the thought could turn into anything permanent. "Let him go," she said. "Let him carry what he has done. That is its own kind of punishment, Cowboy. Longer and harder than any bullet." For they sent him off the property with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a warning that if he was ever seen within 20 miles of the ranch again, mercy would not be offered twice. He rode off into the dark without looking back, and Rowan watched him go with a knot of anger still sitting hard in his chest. And Neva watched the same departure with something closer to grim understanding, the particular clarity of a woman who had already learned, long before this ranch, exactly how desperation could turn even decent people into something they weren't proud of. The days after Emmett's departure settled into a different kind of rhythm. Quieter, simpler, in the way a wound is simpler once the infected part has finally been cut away, even if the healing that follows takes its own kind of time. Rowan didn't hire a replacement right away. Told himself the ranch could manage short-handed a while, though the truth, if he was honest with himself, ran deeper than simple economy. Trusted Emmett, not deeply, not the way he trusted Otis or Frank. But enough that the betrayal had left a mark. Small new wariness that made the idea of trusting a stranger again, for wages, uneasy in his chest. Frank stepped into the gap without being asked, taking on watch rotations with a seriousness Rowan hadn't seen in him before, the kind of serious that comes from a young man realizing, for all at once, that safety isn't something that simply happens around him, but something that has to be actively built and guarded. "Didn't figure you for the responsible type," Rowan told him one evening, watching Frank double-check the fence line for the second time that day. "Didn't figure myself for it either." Frank shrugged, though there was real weight behind the gesture. "Guess almost losing a place makes a man take stock of what it's worth keeping. That mean you're planning on sticking around a while?" "Reckon I am." Frank glanced toward the cabin, where Neva's silhouette moved past the window, tending the evening fire. This outfit's worth sticking around for, even with everything circling it lately." Rowan didn't have much to say to that beyond a nod, but something in his chest eased a little, hearing it. Trust, he was learning, rebuilt itself slowly, draw small proof at a time. Same way everything else worth having in this life seemed to. He walked out to the small fenced plot behind the old nursery shed that same morning. Alone this time, for no particular reason pulling him there except habit, or maybe something closer to gratitude that needed somewhere to be placed. The markers stood the same as always, for a weathered patient, the names softened by years of sun. But something about standing there felt different than it had even a few weeks before, back when Neva had first knelt beside him and spoken her blessing over ground that had waited 3 years for anyone besides him to visit it. Spring's hand changed some, he said, quiet, the 2 markers, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to wood and dirt the way he sometimes still did. "Reckon you'd mind. Hope you wouldn't. Anyhow." The wind moved through the dry grass, indifferent, way it always was, and he stood there a while longer, not expecting an answer, just needing the silence to hold him a moment before he carried whatever he was feeling back toward the rest of his day. "Been thinking on you both more lately," he admitted. "Used to think remembering you meant staying stills, staying stuck right here, same as these markers, never moving past the day I lost you." He looked out toward the cabin, where smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney, starting to think maybe that's not what love asks of a man. Maybe it just asks him to keep carrying you forward instead of leaving you behind to move on without you. He didn't know if that was true, or didn't know if grief worked that neatly tidy conclusions arriving right when a man needed them most, but it felt true enough, standing there, and that was more than he'd had in 3 long years. He touched 2 fingers briefly to each marker, for an old habit, wordless now, and walked back toward the cabin, toward the woman waiting for him there, carrying his family forward instead of leaving them behind, for the way he was only now learning how to do. For the collar had been sitting in the same corner since the night of the storm, half buried in dust, forgotten by daylight, but never quite gone from either of their minds. Roan found it, while clearing out the old tools shed, the same room he'd avoided for 3 years. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he'd finally made himself walk through the door. He carried the collar out to the fire pit at dusk, stood there a moment before setting it down, turning it once in his hands, feeling the old weight of it. Strange how something so small could have caused so much, except it wasn't the collar that had caused anything, was it? It never had been. The collar was just iron, cold, simple. It didn't choose anything, didn't ask anything, didn't hope for anything. He set it in the flames and watched the old iron start to blacken and warp under the heat. Neva came out onto the porch, saw what he was doing, and crossed the yard slowly to stand beside him. "Why now?" she asked. "Because it's time." For he watched the firework at the metal orange light dancing across both their faces. "That thing's been sitting in there since the night I found you. Every time I walked past that shed, some part of me knew it was still in there, waiting." He shook his head. Didn't seem right, letting it wait any longer. "It was never about the collar," Neva said quietly. "You understand that? Not really. I'm starting to. The law only required you to remove it once." She watched the flames with him, close enough now that her shoulder nearly touched his. For everything since then, the fence lines, fever, for the wolves, the nights you sat awake, listening for my breathing to change, none of that was required by any law. Chose it every single time you chose it. For he turned to look at her, firelight catching the side of her face, collar behind them finally losing its shape, entirely dissolving into something unrecognizable. "Guess I did," he said. "Then you are not the man who removed my collar anymore." Her voice had gone soft, softer than he'd ever heard it. "You are the man who kept his promise, long after the law stopped requiring it of him." Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Just stood there, watching the fire finish its work. Two people who had both started this arrangement as strangers bound by circumstance, and were ending it slowly, as something neither of them had a name for yet, but both of them, the first time, wanted to find one for. The judge came 2 days later, uninvited, unwelcome, announced by dust on the horizon that made every hand on the ranch reach for a weapon before they'd even confirmed who it was. Judge Ezra Whitlock rode in, with 2 deputized men flanking him, official-looking papers tucked into a leather satchel, the whole procession carrying itself with the particular arrogance of men who believed the law was something they carried with them, rather than something that existed independent of their convenience. "Hargrove," Whitlock said, mounting with careful dignity, "for I've come on a matter of territorial ordnance. Didn't know we had business." Judge. "We do now." Whitlock produced a paper from his satchel, held it out like it settled everything. "New settlement protection statute, passed by the Territorial Council last session, requires any unsponsored native woman residing outside tribal jurisdiction to be remanded to the reservation agency for processing. For her own protection, you understand." "She's not unsponsored," Roan said. "She's under my roof. My protection for common law arrangements aren't recognized under the statute, I'm afraid." Whitlock's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unless you've got a proper marriage certificate filed with this court, the law considers her unaccounted for, and unaccounted for natives get processed, Mr. Hargrove. That's simply how it works." Has never stepped forward, voice cold and level. "I am not a parcel of land to be processed, Judge." Whitlock's eyes flicked to her, assessing cold. "The law doesn't much concern itself with how a thing prefers to be described, ma'am, or only with how it's classified." "Funny," Roan said. There's something dangerous creeping into his voice now. How this ordinance shows up right around the same time Rourke Moreno starts asking after her by name. Pratt landed. Whitlock's composure flickered, just barely, just long enough for Roan to be certain he'd struck something true. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Hargrove. I think you know exactly what I'm implying." Roan held the man's gaze, unflinching. "Purdy tells me you and Moreno get on real friendly, for a judge and an outlaw. Friendly enough to pass a law that just so happens to hand you a legal reason to take what he wants, but can't quite manage to keep hold of himself. Whitlock's jaw tightened. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Whitlock studied Roan a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes. And when he spoke again, his voice had shed its official pretense entirely, dropping into something plainer and colder. Let me speak frankly, Mr. Hargrove, since you seem disinclined toward pleasantries. He glanced toward Neva, then back. I don't much care what happens to her, one way or the other. Never have, but Rourke Moreno cares. Forber cares enough that continued interference in his business has a way of becoming very costly for the men who provide it. I'd hoped, for your sake, that you'd see reason before it came to formal proceedings, and if I don't, then formal proceedings arrive with formal enforcement. Whitlock's smile returned, thin and humourless. I can bring 6 armed deputies to this property inside a week, Mr. Hargrove, all of them carrying paper that says the law is on their side. You can meet that with rifles, if you like. But I'd remind you that shooting at deputized officers of this territory tends to end considerably worse for ranchers than it does for judges. Tied behind paper, you wrote yourself to help a man who trades in stolen women. I'd enforce the law of this territory, same as I'm sworn to. Whitlock's eyes were flat, untroubled by the accusation. What Moreno does with the outcome isn't my concern. For a judge only concerns himself with the law as written, Mr. Hargrove. The rest is simply consequence. That's a real comfortable place to stand, Judge. Writing laws that just happen to serve a man paying you to write them, then calling yourself innocent of what they're used for. For a long moment, 2 men simply stared each other down, France for the whole ranch holding its breath around them, until Whitlock finally folded the paper back into his satchel with deliberate calm. I'll be back, he said, echoing, whether he meant to or not, for words Roan had already heard once before, from a different man wearing a different kind of authority. Proper enforcement next time. This isn't finished, Mr. Hargrove. He rode off with his 2 deputies, dust rising behind them, and Roan stood watching them go, with a cold certainty settling into his chest. 2 threats now, circling from different directions. And somewhere between them, a debt 3 years in the making that was about to come due, one way or another. Ran lingered after the judge's dust had settled, standing apart from the others, watching Roan with that same careful wait he'd carried since the day he first rode into the yard. This law he speaks of, Ran said, once they were alone by the corral, for it will not stop with her. You understand this? Figured as much. A man who can write a law to take 1 woman can write a law to take 100. Whitlock is not the danger here. Whitlock is only the pen. Moreno is the hand that guides it. Ran's jaw tightened. For I have seen this before, Cowboy. Different names, different territories, always the same pattern. Men with badges finding new words for old theft. You sound like you've got history with it. Something shifted in the older man's face, that same guilt Niver had noticed, surfacing fully now, unmistakable. For I have history with many things I am not yet ready to speak of. Ran's voice had gone rough. There is a debt I owe your wife in all, but name that I have not found the courage to name aloud. Even to her, I ask you to be patient with me a while longer, until I find that courage. Roan studied him a long moment, remembering the guilt he'd glimpsed on the hunt, the careful way Ran avoided certain questions. Whatever it is, Roan said slowly, she deserves to hear it from you. Not from anybody else. From shadows she keeps almost seeing and talking herself out of. I know. Ran's eyes were distant, fixed on something only he could see. I am trying to find the right moment. I fear there may not be one, only moments that are simply less wrong than others. He said nothing further. Ron didn't press. For though the exchange sat heavy in his chest the rest of that evening, for one more piece of a puzzle he could feel taking shape without yet seeing its full picture. The warriors made ready to leave the following morning. Ran's business at the ranch concluded. For now, though the parting carried none of the finality it might have carried a week earlier. We cannot stay, Ran said, cracking the girth on his horse while the rest of the camp broke down around him. There are others of our people scattered across this territory who need looking after, same as you did. But we are not far. 3 days' ride, no more, at the winter camp near the Salt Flats' northern edge. Obliged for that, Roan said. For all of it, the hunt, the proof, whatever it is you decided about me out there, I decided you are a man worth trusting with something precious. Ran's eyes drifted toward Neva, helping one of the younger warriors load supplies nearby. For whether I am equally worth trusting is a question I am still working to answer for myself. You keep saying things like that. I keep meaning them. Ran finished with the girth, turned to face Roan fully. If Moreno moves against this ranch in force, send word. 3 days' ride is not so far that we could not return it in time to matter if the warning reaches us quickly enough. How would I send word that fast? Ran produced a small bundle of feathers tied with red cord from his saddlebag, pressed it into Rowan's hand. For burn this at the highest point of your land. Smoke carries a particular colour when feathers burn this way. Any of our scouts within 2 days' ride will see it, and know to come. Rowan turned the bundle over in his hands, oddly moved by the simple trust of the gesture. Didn't figure I'd earn something like this so fast. You did not earn it fast, Ran said. You earned it over 4 months of choices. Nobody was watching closely enough to notice, until we arrived and started watching very closely indeed. A pause, something almost warm crossing his weathered face. Take care of her, Cowboy, for whatever comes. Neva came to say her own goodbye a few minutes later, and whatever passed between her and Ran in that final embrace was quieter, harder to read. The warmth of family reunited, still tangled up with whatever unspoken debt continued to sit between them. You will come back, she said, not quite a question. I will come back, Ran promised, and when I do, Neverkaya, I will finally tell you everything. I have been too much of a coward to say until now. You have my word on that, whatever my word may still be worth to you. She watched him ride out with the others, rising familiar and fading across the flats. Roan stood beside her, saying nothing, letting her have the silence she needed until the last rider had disappeared entirely from view. He is going to break my heart, she said quietly, once they were alone again. Whatever this secret is, I can feel for coming for, the way you feel a storm building before the first cloud even appears. You don't know that. I know enough. She turned back toward the cabin, her voice steady, despite the weight behind it. I have learned to trust that feeling, Cowboy. Kept me alive more than once. He didn't have an answer for that. Walked beside her, back toward the house, for one more piece of dread, settling quietly into a day that had otherwise felt, for the first time in a long while, almost peaceful. That night, neither of them could sleep. Roan sat by the fire long after the household had gone quiet, turning over everything Moreno. To judge Fran's careful guilt, Remed's betrayal, the collar finally reduced to unrecognizable metal in the ashes outside. Much. All of it arriving too close together, like a storm that had been building for years, and had finally decided tonight was the night to break. His mind wouldn't settle. Fror kept circling back to the same question over and over, worrying at it, the way a man worries a loose tooth even though he knows it'll hurt every time. What was he doing? Or what was any of this? A woman he'd known 4 months, a law he hadn't asked for, a grief he'd carried alone so long he barely remembered what it felt like to carry anything with somebody else beside him. Except that wasn't quite true either, was it? Because somewhere in these 4 months, without ever once sitting down and deciding to, he'd stopped carrying it alone, which should have scared him more than it did. Except it didn't scare him nearly as much as the alternative, going back to how things were. Before the storm, before the collar, before a stranger's stillness had cracked something open in him he'd thought was sealed shut for good. Neva came and sat beside him without a word, didn't ask what he was thinking. Just sat close enough that her shoulder rested against his, offering the same quiet presence she'd offered the night he'd wept for a wife and son he couldn't bring back. Scared? He asked finally into the silence. No hesitation. No pretending otherwise. Are you? Yeah, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Been scared a long time, if I'm honest. Just didn't have anything left worth being scared for. Until you. She turned to look at him, firelight soft on her face. Something open and unguarded in her expression that he'd never seen there before. Not once, in all the weeks he'd known her. That is a dangerous thing to admit to a woman, Cowboy. Figured it was time to stop being careful about it. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then she reached up, slow, deliberate, touched his face not out of duty, not out of law, not out of anything except the simple, uncomplicated truth of wanting to. Spent my whole life having choices made for me, she said quietly. By Moreno, by men who thought a collar could decide what I was worth, or even by my own uncle, if the shadows I keep seeing in his eyes turn out to be real. Her thumb traced, gentle, along his jaw. This is the first choice that has ever truly been mine to make. You don't have to. I know I do not have to. Her voice was steady now, certain in a way that left no room for doubt. That is exactly why I am choosing to. What if I am not what you should be choosing? The words came out before he could stop them, some old fear finally finding its voice. For what if all I do is bring you more of what you've already survived too much of? Danger, loss, men circling this ranch who won't stop until one of us is in the ground. Then we will face it. She didn't flinch from the question, met it head on the way she met everything. But do not mistake danger for a reason to refuse what is good simply because it might not last. I have already lost too much time to that kind of fear, Cowboy. I will not lose this too. This, whatever this is. For whatever we are building here, one fence post and one fever and one collar burned to nothing at a time. Her hand found his, fingers lacing through his own, steady and certain. For I do not need forever promise to me. I have learned better than to trust promises that large. I only need tonight, to be honest. Can you give me that? Yeah. His voice came rougher than he meant it to. That much I can give you. He didn't say anything else. Leaned in, slow, for giving her every chance to change her mind, for every chance to step back. She didn't step back. What happened between them that night was not loud, not desperate, nothing at all like the collar, the law, the debt that had first brought them into each other's orbit. Quiet, careful. Two people who had both been broken by loss finding, for in each other, something neither of them had expected to survive long enough to feel again, tenderness offered freely, regret with tenderness offered just as freely in return, for every touch a question, for every answer a choice made new. Ward, for they lay together by the dying fire, her head resting against his chest, his arm around her in a way that felt less like protection now, and more like simple, uncomplicated belonging. For I still haven't told you I love you, he said, quiet. Into the dark. No, she agreed, just as quiet. You have not. Figured the words might matter less than everything I've already done. She was silent a moment, her smile against his skin, small, real, unguarded. They matter, she said. But you are right, they matter less than the fence lines you mended, and the fever you sat through, and the name you finally learned to call me by. A pause, her voice softening further. The words will come, Cowboy, when you are ready. For I am not in any hurry to rush a man who has already given me everything else. Outside, desert lay quiet under a wide, indifferent sky, for giving no hint of the danger, still circling closer with every passing day, Moreno regrouping, the judge plotting his next move, Fran carrying some unspoken guilt that hadn't yet found its way into open air. For tonight, inside the small cabin that had once held nothing but grief, there was warmth instead. Choice instead of obligation. For two people who had both started this arrangement as strangers bound by a law neither of them asked for, France of finding their way, slowly and honestly, towards something neither law nor loss could take from them now, for it wouldn't last. Some part of both of them already knew that, even in the quiet of that single stolen night, but for now it was theirs. Morning came soft and gold, for the kind of desert dawn that made a person forget briefly, for everything waiting to complicate it. Roan woke first, watching Neva sleep in a way he hadn't let himself watch anyone sleep in 3 long years, for memorizing the particular rhythm of her breathing, the way one hand had curled loosely against his chest sometime in the night without either of them deciding it should. She woke slower than usual, blinking against the light. First thing she did was check his face, searching for something regret, maybe, or the particular retreat men sometimes performed once morning stripped away the honesty of the night before. She didn't find it. You are staring, she said. Been doing that a while now, apparently. How long? Since about the time you told me sand meant something worth having. For he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and hurried, the gesture of a man who had finally stopped rationing his own tenderness. Took me longer than it should have to admit it. You cowboys are slow about most things that matter. Some of us catch up eventually. She studied him a long moment, something soft moving behind her eyes that he was starting to recognize as trust finally settling somewhere permanent. For eventually, she agreed, will have to be enough for now. Outside, Otis's voice carried faintly across the yard, for calling the morning's first orders to Frank, the ordinary rhythm of ranch life, continuing regardless of what had shifted overnight inside the small cabin at its center. Somewhere beyond the fence line, danger was still gathering Moreno's grudge, the judge's paper threats, Fran's unspoken guilt, for all of it circling closer with each day that passed. For this one quiet morning, none of it had arrived yet. And Roan Hargrove, lying in the gold desert light beside a woman who had walked into his life wearing another man's chains and walked out of them entirely her own, found himself thinking, first time in 3 long years, for that maybe survival wasn't the only thing left worth reaching for. Maybe there was room, after everything, for something more than that. Trouble has a smell to it, out on the flats. Dust that sits different in the air, a stillness that isn't peace so much as everything, holding its breath at once. Roan felt it 3 days after the warriors rode out. Couldn't have said what tipped him. Just an old rancher's instinct, the same one that had kept him up the night before the corral raid, whispering that the quiet wasn't going to last. He walked the fence line twice that morning, checking nothing in particular, just needing his hands busy, while his mind worked through possibilities he didn't want to name out loud. Neva noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything these days, the way a person learns to notice the small changes in someone they've decided to build a life alongside. "You are pacing," she said, catching him at the north corner for the second time. "Ranchers don't pace." "Patrol. You are patrolling territory that has not changed since yesterday." "Man's allowed to check his own fence twice. Man is allowed to admit he is worried also." Fell into step beside him, unbothered by his deflection, patient in the particular way she'd become patient with him over the months. It would save us both some time. He let out a breath. "Feels different lately. Can't put a finer point on it than that. I feel it too." She looked out toward the horizon, where the flats stretched pale and empty under the morning sun. "Ran taught me, when I was young, that the desert speaks before trouble arrives, if a person knows how to listen. I have been listening for 3 days. I do not like what I am hearing. It didn't last. Purdy sent word first, a boy on a fast horse who arrived at the ranch, sweating and out of breath, carrying a note scrawled in the shopkeeper's cramped hand. Moreno's crew had swelled. New riders, hard men from over the border, the kind who worked for coin and didn't ask what the coin had paid for before. And Judge Whitlock had been seen riding out of town 2 days back with 6 deputized men and a wagon full of rifles. Nobody in town remembered him requisitioning through any lawful channel. Roan read the note twice, folded it, handed it to Neva without a word, because some things didn't need explaining between them anymore. She read it once, set it down. 3 days, she said. "Maybe less, figure the same." "Then we are not ready." "No," he agreed. "We're not." The boy who'd carried the message stood awkwardly near the porch, clearly reluctant to ride back through country that might already be dangerous. "Purdy said you might want to send a reply," the boy offered, "or that I could stay on if you needed another set of hands. Not much of a shot, but I can reload fast, and I ain't afraid of hard work." Roan studied him a moment, young earnest, or clearly more frightened than he was letting on, but standing his ground regardless. "What's your name, son Danny, sir?" "Danny Coulter." Something in the name landed unexpectedly hard in Roan's chest, close enough to his own son's name that he had to take a breath before answering. "Obliged for the offer, Danny," read finally, voice steady despite the private weight of the moment. "But I'd rather you ride back to town safe than stay here and risk getting caught in something you didn't sign up for. Tell Purdy we're grateful for the warning. Tell him to keep his own doors barred, case any of Moreno's crew decide town's worth hitting too." The boy nodded, relieved despite his earlier bravado, and rode off at a hard gallop back toward town, leaving the ranch to its final preparations. Neva watched Rowan's face carefully once the boy had gone. "That name meant something to you." "Just a coincidence," he said. "Close enough to Daniel's that it caught me off guard is all." "Grief finds strange doors to walk through," she said gently. "Even a stranger's name can be one of them." He didn't argue that. Franz turned back toward the work, still waiting, carrying the small unexpected ache alongside everything else the coming days would demand of him. 4. He climbed to the highest point of the ranch that same afternoon and burned Ran's feather bundle, the way he'd been shown, watching the smoke rise thin and strange-colored against the pale sky, carrying whatever signal it carried out toward a camp 3 days distant. For it will not reach them in time. Prince, watching beside him, understanding the arithmetic as clearly as he did. 3 days there. However fast they ride back, that is time we do not have, sending it anyway. I did not say do not send it. She watched the last of the smoke thin into nothing. Frost said it will not save us in the fight, it may still matter after. Someone should know what happened here one way or another. He didn't argue that either. Watched the smoke fade, understanding, the same as she did, for that whatever help was coming would arrive too late to change what was about to happen, and in time only to help carry what remained of it afterward. For they worked through what daylight remained, turning the ranch into something closer to a fortress than a home. Frank reinforced the shutters. Otis dug a second firing position behind the water trough, muttering the whole time about how a man his age shouldn't have to be digging anything, though his hands never once slowed. Back in my day, grumbled, tramping down the last of the loose earth around his new position. Trouble had the decency to announce itself proper. A man rode up, said his piece. You shot him or you didn't. Nowadays it's judges and lawyers and men who hide behind paper instead of just shooting you honest like their granddaddies did. World's changing, Otis, Frank called down from the barn loft, checking the angle of his own firing position for the 3rd time. World's getting worse is what it's doing. Otis spat into the dirt for emphasis. Give me an honest outlaw over a crooked judge any day of the week. Fra never walked the perimeter twice, marking weak points, planning fallback positions with the same cold precision she'd used the night she'd faced down 3 riders alone. She paused at each section of fence, running her fingers along the wire, feeling tension, muttering calculations under her breath that Rowan had learned by now, for not to interrupt. How many can we hold off? He asked. Once she'd finished her 2nd circuit, depends how many come. She met his eyes steadily. Or, if it is only Moreno's crew, we hold. If the judge brings these alongside them, it becomes harder. If both arrive together in full force, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to, we'll manage. We will try. Her honesty even now refused to soften into comfortable lies. That is the most either of us can honestly promise. But something in her had gone quieter since Purdy's note arrived. Distant, in a way Rowan noticed and didn't yet understand. 4. He found her that evening sitting alone on the porch step, staring out at nothing, the same posture she'd worn the night the warriors first arrived. 4. You're somewhere else, he said, easing down beside her. I keep thinking about Ran. He's 3 days' ride off. Feathers and smoke, remember. We can call him if it comes to that. That is not what I am thinking about. She turned to look at him, something raw and unfinished behind her eyes. I am thinking about the promise he made, that he would come back and finally tell me everything. Her hands twisted together in her lap, an unfamiliar gesture from a woman who rarely fidgeted at all. I have spent days trying to guess what it could be, and every guess I make frightens me more than the last. Might not be as bad as you're imagining, or it might be worse. Her voice had gone very quiet. For I have learned, Cowboy, that the things people are most afraid to say out loud are usually exactly as bad as the silence around them suggests. He didn't have an answer for that. Took her hand, let him, and they sat together a long while as the sun went down over a ranch bracing itself for a war neither of them had chosen, but both of them now understood was finally, roadably, arriving. Ran rode in alone the next morning. No warriors beside him this time, just a single exhausted horse, and a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in the handful of days since he'd ridden away. Neva was at the gate before he'd even dismounted. You said 3 days, she said. It has not been 3 days. I could not wait 3 days. Ran's voice was rough, wrecked, a man who had clearly been fighting some private battle the entire ride back. Word reached our camp of what is coming. And I understood the moment I heard it that I could not let you face it without first telling you the truth I promised you. His eyes found hers, full of a grief so old it had calcified into something almost physical. Revakaya, I need you to sit with me. There is no way to make this gentle, and I am done trying to find one. 4. They sat together in the shade of the barn, Fran standing a short distance off, close enough to be present, far enough to give them the privacy this conversation demanded. 4. The winter after the soldiers came for our grazing land, Fran began, voice steady only through obvious effort, for our people scattered into smaller camps, trying to survive the season without enough food stored, for without enough men left standing to hunt properly. Father's camp, our camp was starving, Neva, truly starving, children too weak to cry, elders who had stopped eating entirely so the young might have their share. He stopped, started again. A man came to me. Not Moreno himself. One of his associates in those days before Moreno built the operation into what it is now. For he offered guns. Food, enough to save the camp through the winter, in exchange for what? Neva's voice had gone flat, bracing for the answer she already suspected, information. Ran's hands were shaking now, though his voice held. 4. He wanted to know the location of a smaller family group, further out, separated from the main camp during the soldiers' raid. Isolated, undefended, his eyes closed briefly. I told myself it was different people, strangers, not our own blood. I told myself the trade would save more lives than it cost. 4. He opened his eyes, and what was in them broke something in Neva's face before he even finished the sentence. I did not know, Neva Kaya. I swear to you on your mother's memory, I did not know the family group was yours, your parents, your brothers. For I did not learn it was you they took until it was already far too late to undo. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Roan felt it stretch across the whole ranch, the birds gone quiet, even the wind seeming to hold itself back. You sold my family, Neva said finally. Not a question. A verdict delivered in a voice gone hollow with the particular shock of a wound too deep to fully register yet, for guns. Food to feed a camp that was not even the one you betrayed. Yes, and when I was taken. When my parents died, for my brothers died, and I was carried off in chains, her voice cracked. The first real crack Rowan had ever heard in it was the price. What you traded me for? Yes. Ran's voice had broken entirely now, tears running freely down a face carved by decades of hard decisions that had finally, after all this time, caught up with him completely. I have carried this every single day since. For I searched for you for 2 years after. For once I understood what I had done, hoping to find you, undo even a fraction of the harm. For when I finally heard you were alive, sheltered here, I told myself I would confess immediately. His hands opened, empty, helpless. I was a coward instead. I let myself have a little more time with you as your uncle, before I became, in your eyes, the man who caused everything you survived. 2 years, she said it, like the number itself was a wound. You searched 2 years. Do you know what those 2 years held for me, Ran? 4. Do you have any understanding at all of what I survived while you were out there searching for a way to feel less guilty? I do not need to know the details to understand it was unforgivable. Then why are you telling me now? Her voice rose, sharp, the first real anger she'd let surface since he began speaking. Why not let me keep the memory of the uncle who taught me to track deer, instead of poisoning it with the truth that he was also the man who handed me to Moreno like livestock traded for grain? 4. Because you deserve the truth more than I deserve your comfortable memory of me. Ran met her eyes, despite the pain it clearly cost him. 4. Because a love built on a lie is not real love, Neva Kaya, however comfortable the lie might feel. I would rather you hate me knowing the truth than love a version of me that never existed. Neva stood, walked several paces away. With her back to both of them, shoulders rigid, Rowan understood, watching her, for that this single conversation had just done something to her that 3 years in Moreno's camp had never fully managed, cracked open a grief so foundational it reshaped everything she thought she knew about her own history. Leave, she said finally, not turning around. For I cannot look at you right now. I do not know if I will ever be able to again. Ran didn't argue, didn't beg. Just nodded once, accepting a verdict he'd clearly been expecting for years. I understand, he said quietly, but I am not leaving the territory, Neverkai. For whatever you decide about me, I intend to be here when Moreno arrives. That much at least I can still do right. For he walked back toward his exhausted horse. And Roan watched him go, carrying a guilt that had just finally For, been set down in the open air, after years of festering in silence, though setting it down, Roan understood, hadn't lightened it in the slightest, only made it visible to everyone else for the first time. Neva didn't speak for the rest of that day. Frot worked the fence lines in silence, sharpened blades that didn't need sharpening, kept her hands busy, because her hands were the only part of her still willing to cooperate. Roan gave her the space. For didn't push, didn't offer hollow comfort, understood that some wounds needed room to simply exist before they could be tended. It was well past dark when she finally came to find him sitting by the fire pit where the collar had burned weeks before. "I keep trying to hate him," Bree said, for, without preamble, sitting down beside him. "It would be simpler, cleaner. A man who sold his own family deserves hatred, uncomplicated and total, but I remember him teaching me to track deer before I could hold a full bow. I remember him carrying me on his shoulders through deep snow so my feet would not freeze. For I remember loving him my whole life before this, and that love does not simply vanish because of one terrible winter and one terrible choice." Her hands twisted together in the firelight. "I do not know how to hold both of those things at once. For the love and the wound, they feel like they should cancel each other out. They do not. Maybe they're not supposed to cancel out," Roan said carefully. "Maybe that's just what it means to love somebody who's failed you. You don't stop loving them, for you just carry the failure alongside it. Best you can." She looked at him a long moment. "You would know something about that," she said. "Carrying failure alongside love. You have been doing it 3 years, over a grave you could not have prevented. Different kind of failure. Is it?" Voice was gentle now, gentler than he expected. Or is grief, simply grief, however it arrives, Cowboy, however complicated the shape of it turns out to be? He didn't have an answer for that. Just sat with her in the firelight. Two people who understood, in their own separate ways, for exactly how heavy an unfinished grief could sit in a person's chest. Bree went to find Ran the next morning, but before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, finding him exactly where she expected, awake, alone, keeping watch over the eastern approach, as though standing guard might somehow begin repaying what words alone never could. "For I did not sleep," she said, coming to stand beside him. "For neither did I. I do not forgive you." The words came steady, unflinching. "I want you to understand that clearly before whatever comes today. I do not know if I ever will. I do not expect you to." His voice was rough with exhaustion and grief in equal measure. "For I do not deserve it, and I would not trust it if you offered it too quickly, out of fear that today might be our last chance." "But," she turned to face him fully, "I loved you before I knew. That love was not a lie, even if what you did with your silence afterward very nearly was. For I am choosing to believe both things can be true. The love and the anger. I am done pretending grief has to be simple, to be honest." Something in Ran's weathered face broke open, gratitude and grief tangled together so completely he could no longer separate them. "More mercy than I came here expecting," he said, "not mercy." She held his gaze unflinching. "It is honesty. I told you once that I have had enough of my life decided by other people's timing, other people's law. I am deciding this on my own terms, Uncle. Or not because you have earned forgiveness, because I refuse to let what you did poison the parts of my own heart that are still capable of loving somebody complicated." She paused. "Do not mistake this for absolution, for it is simply the truth, and the truth is rarely as clean as either of us would prefer." He nodded, slow, accepting the distinction without argument. "For whatever comes today," he said, "know that I intend to spend however much life remains to me, proving that I understood what you have just told me. Not asking forgiveness, simply trying, finally, to be worth the love you have not entirely withdrawn." She left him there at his post, carrying something lighter than the crushing grief she'd carried the day before, though far from healed, far from settled. Some wounds, she was learning, did not close all at once. They simply became bearable enough to carry forward, one honest conversation at a time. Moreno's forces arrived at dawn 2 days later, and this time there was no unhurried smile, no medallion turned slow between 2 fingers. This time there was simply the full weight of everything that had been circling this ranch for months, finally closing in at once. Rourke Moreno's crew came from the east, 20 riders, strong, spread wide across the flats like something poured rather than ridden. From the west, Judge Whitlock's deputies advanced with their wagon of rifles and their paper that claimed the law was on their side. Through separate storms, converging on the same small piece of ground, France and Roane stood on his own porch watching them come with a strange, for cold clarity settling over him, the particular calm that arrives only once a man understands there's no more room left for anything except the fight itself. His mind raced even as his hands stayed steady, checking his rifle, for counting cartridges, running through the same calculations Neva had already run twice that morning. 20 riders, 6 deputies, 4 defenders, for counting himself, counting Never, counting 2 ranch hands who'd signed on for cattle work, and not this, for except numbers weren't the whole of it, were they? Never had been. A man with everything to lose fought different than a man simply collecting a wage, and Roane intended to make that difference count for every ounce it was worth. He called out. France and Frank moved to the spots they'd spent 2 days preparing, and Neva took up the rifle she'd carried since the night she first met 3 riders alone to the fence line, and never once flinched. "Is it?" she said, checking her ammunition with steady hands. "This is it," he agreed. She looked at him a long moment, something fierce and unguarded passing between them. "Whatever happens," she said, "I am glad. The storm brought me to that tree. I am glad you were the one riding past." "Wasn't luck," he said. "Wasn't law either. Just you were worth stopping for. Simple as that." "There is something I have been waiting to hear you say," she said, "and something I have been waiting for the right moment to say myself. This does not feel like the right moment, but I am no longer certain we are owed a better one." "Then say it anyway." "Not yet." Her voice was steady, despite everything the moment demanded. "I want the words to arrive when we have earned the right to actually enjoy them, not shouted over gunfire with no time left to mean them properly. Live through today, Cowboy. Then we will find that moment." "Fair enough." He held her gaze a beat longer than the danger really allowed. "Then let's both live long enough to earn it." Neither of them had time to say anything else. The first shots were already ringing out across the flats. The battle that followed came in pieces, the way real violence always does, not the clean narrative of a story told afterward, but a chaos of noise and dust and split-second decisions that would only make sense once the smoke finally cleared. Because that was the truth nobody prepared you for. Not the fear. Fear a man could brace himself against. It was the noise. The way gunfire didn't sound like the crack of a single rifle once a dozen of them fire together, but became something else entirely, a continuous roar that swallowed thought, swallowed planning, bereft only reaction and instinct, and the cold certainty that stopping meant dying. Protus held the water trough position with a steadiness that belied his age, dropping 2 riders before Moreno's crew even reached the outer fence. He worked the bolt of his rifle with the mechanical calm of a man who'd been doing this kind of thing since before most of the riders coming at him were born, muttering old curses under his breath between shots, never once raising his voice. Frank fought from the barn loft, and though his hands shook between shots, they never once missed when it mattered. For every round he sent found a horse pulled up short, a rider forced to scatter, the particular chaos of good aim disrupting a coordinated charge before it could fully form. Fought beside Roane at the porch, her rifle and her knowledge of the terrain proving as lethal as any weapon Moreno's men carried, and more than once Roane found himself grateful. Strange, narrow focus of combat. The woman had spent years learning exactly how to survive against impossible odds. "Flank," she called out. Spotting movement Roane hadn't caught yet. Got it. He swung, fired, watched a rider go down before he'd fully processed the shot. Behind the wagon. Her voice stayed level even as bullets kicked up dust inches from where they crouched. Seeing it, which was the strange rhythm combat settled into once the initial shock burned away. Not conversation exactly, something more efficient. Through 2 people who trusted each other completely, calling out danger and trusting the other to answer it, over and over, until the pattern became its own kind of language. A rider broke through the outer fence near the barn, closer to Frank's position than anyone had accounted for, and for one heart-stopping second Roane watched the man level his rifle at the loft where Frank crouched exposed. Fired before Rowan's own mind fully caught up to the danger. Clean. certain the rider dropped before his shot ever left the barrel. "Frank," Roan called out, voice raw. "You good?" "Good," Frank shouted back, though his voice cracked with the particular adrenaline of a man who'd just watched death pass close enough to touch. "Oh, you won, Neva. Pay me back by staying alive," she called, for already scanning for the next threat. No time to linger on what had nearly happened. 4. The judge's deputies pressed from the west, less coordinated than Moreno's crew, clearly uncertain about the wisdom of dying for a paycheck attached to paperwork none of them had bothered to read closely. 2 of them broke off entirely within the first 10 minutes, riding hard back the way they'd come, unwilling to trade their lives for a settlement statute they'd never fully believed in anyway. It was Ran who turned the tide when the tide most needed turning. He'd stationed himself unasked at the narrow wash on the eastern approach, the exact route Moreno's reserve riders would need to flank the ranch and catch its defenders from behind. No warriors beside him this time, no camp to call for backup. Old man with a rifle and a debt he'd finally decided to pay in full. He held that wash for nearly 10 minutes against 6 riders, 4, buying the ranch time it desperately needed, taking 2 wounds himself before the reserve finally broke off, deciding the position wasn't worth the cost. 4. By the time Roan reached him, crossing open ground under fire to do it, Fran was on his knees in the sand, for blood soaking through his shirt, France for breathing in short, wet gasps that told Roan everything he needed to know about how this was going to end. Roan started. "Do not waste breath telling me to hold on, Cowboy." Ran's voice was thin now, fading. "I am not holding on. I am finally, after years, letting something go." He gripped Roan's arm with surprising strength. "Tell Neva Kaya that I am sorry does not begin to cover what I owe her, but that everything I did today I did because I finally understood what love should have looked like from the start. Not silence, not a debt, paid quietly to ease my own conscience." Breath rattled. "Protection, given without being asked, the way you have given it to her every day since the storm. Tell her yourself. There is not time for that." Fran's eyes were losing focus now, fixed on something beyond the fight, beyond the ranch, beyond anything Roan could see. "Or let her know I died, trying to be the man I should have been from the beginning. Let that be enough if forgiveness cannot be." His grip on Roan's arm loosened, tightened once more, sudden, urgent. "One more thing." Words came slower now, each one costing him visibly more than the last. "Tell her the healing line does not end with her. Tell her I saw it in the girl she has started teaching. The old woman was right. Something survives even after everything we have lost. Or make sure she knows that. Make sure she believes it. I'll tell her." "Good." Something almost like peace crossed his ruined face. "Oh, good." He didn't speak again. Neva reached them moments later, having fought her way across the same open ground, and what she found there broke something in her face that Roan would carry the memory of for the rest of his own life. She knelt beside her uncle's body, said nothing at first, just pressed her palm flat against his chest, the same gesture she'd used at Rowan's family's grave weeks before, some wordless blessing passing between the living and the dead. "Forgive you," she said finally, quiet, though he could no longer hear it. "For I did not know until this moment that I would be able to say that. I do." Her voice broke completely. "You died protecting exactly the family you failed to protect the first time. That has to mean something. I choose to believe it means everything. There was no time to grieve further, for the battle was still raging around them. And grief, for like everything else out here, would have to wait its turn." Rowan found Rourke Moreno at the center of the yard, for exactly where a man like that would position himself close enough to direct his crew, far enough to avoid the worst of the danger himself, for at least until the numbers finally turned against him. Griever moved to follow. Rowan caught her arm once, long enough to hold her eyes. "Part's mine," he said. "He is not only your grief, Cowboy. I know that." His voice was steady, despite everything roaring around them. "But 3 years I carried this alone. Feels right to finish it the same way, if you'll let me." She studied him a long moment, understanding passing between them without needing further words. "Then finish it," she said. "I will be watching your back the whole time. That much I will not compromise on." They faced each other across 10 feet of blood-churned dust, Rowan and Rourke, 3 years of unfinished grief, standing between them like something physical. "Here we are," Rourke said, still wearing that same unbothered smile. For, though something had finally started to crack behind it, from recognition that today wasn't unfolding the way his confidence had promised him it would. "Didn't figure you'd still be standing, Cowboy, this far into things." "Figured wrong." "Seems I did." Rourke's hand drifted, almost absent, toward the medallion still hanging at his throat. "You want this back that bad?" 3 years chasing a piece of silver. It wasn't ever about the silver. No, something shifted in Rourke's expression, understanding finally arriving. It wasn't. His eyes flicked briefly to the chaos still unfolding around them, crews scattering, his numbers failing, and something like real fear finally surfaced beneath the practiced calm. "Your wife, your boy, I remember them better than I let on that first morning. Woman fought hard, real hard. I've thought about that more than I ever admitted to anyone." Something in Rowan went very still, very cold, very quiet. "Don't!" he said. "Don't what?" "Don't tell you the truth this close to the end. Figure a dying man's owed at least that much honesty." Rourke's smile had gone thin, brittle, the mask of finally slipping entirely. "She said your name at the end." "Did you know that?" "Called for you right up until—" He never finished the sentence, for the gunfight that followed lasted only seconds, though it felt to Rowan like it stretched across the full 3 years, since the night he'd come home to smoke on the horizon and a grave he'd have to dig himself. Whose shots? Both his. Both true. Rourke Moreno went down in the same dust that had carried his crew onto this land, the medallion catching one last flash of morning light before he hit the ground and didn't move again. Rowan stood over him a long moment, waiting to feel something. Relief, vindication, the particular satisfaction 3 years of searching should have earned him. What he felt instead was simply tired. Tired and finally, possibly free. The moment didn't hold. Because one of Rourke's men, watching his leader fall, made one last desperate choice before breaking off, entirely raised his rifle, fired wild and close, and Rowan felt the impact take him high in the chest before he'd even registered the shot. The world tilted, went white at the edges. He was on the ground before he understood he'd fallen, hand cool against his cheek, the sky above him spinning slow and strange. The rider who'd fired didn't get another chance. Neva's shot took him from 30 yards, clean and final, before he could even wheel his horse to flee. Reached Rowan seconds later, dropping to her knees beside him in the same dust that had swallowed Moreno moments before, hands already moving to the wound, pressing hard, face gone white with a fear he'd never once seen on her, not even the night they'd first met, trained to a tree in a storm. "Stay with me," she said, voice cracking. "You hear me, Cowboy? Stay with me." Trying. His voice came out thin, wrong, barely his own. "You are not permitted to die today. I forbid it." Her hands pressed harder against the wound, blood dark between her fingers. "I did not survive Moreno's camp, lose my family, and bury my uncle just this morning. Lose you too, in the very same breath. Do you understand me? I forbid it, Bossy," he managed, some ghost of humour surfacing even now. Yes, tears were falling freely now, unashamed, unhidden. "I am Bossy. I am also the last woman standing between you and the ground. You will listen to me regardless." France, somewhere behind her, for the last of the fighting was finally dying down. Otis and Frank mopping up what little resistance remained. The ranch, slowly. France, painfully, reclaiming its silence. But none of that mattered to Neva in this moment. Only the man bleeding beneath her hands, and the terrible possibility that everything they'd built together might end here, in the same dirt that had already claimed so much. "Listen to me," she said, low, urgent, pressing her forehead briefly to his. "You once told me the law never asked either of us what we wanted. You were right, so I am done waiting for a law or a collar or anyone else's permission to say this plainly." Her voice broke and steadied in the same breath. "I do not belong to you because some rule said I must. I do not belong to anyone but myself, and I never will again. Through Moreno, brought to any law written by men who never once asked what I wanted. But I choose you. Freely, Completely. Today and every day after, if you are stubborn enough to survive, long enough to let me keep choosing you." His eyes found hers, hazy with pain but present, holding. "Not going anywhere," he managed. "Too ornery to die in the dirt when I've got a wedding to plan. Then prove it," she said fiercely. "Fight for it, the way you have fought for everything else since the night you knelt in the mud for a stranger." He held on. Barely. But he held. For the remaining raiders broke and scattered. Once their leader fell, the particular cowardice of men who'd only ever followed strength and had none of their own once it was gone. 4. Judge Whitlock's deputies, seeing the tide turn decisively against the arrangement they'd been paid to enforce, hesitated at the fence line, uncertain suddenly of exactly what they were dying for. Whitlock himself made the mistake of riding closer to assess the situation, close enough that Otis, still holding his position at the water trough, put a bullet through his saddlebag and sent a leather satchel spilling open across the dirt. Papers scattered in the wind. Otis crossed to gather them himself, rifle still trained on the deputies with the other hand, and what he found among Whitlock's scattered correspondence turned the tide of the day one final time. Letters, dated, signed, damning, detailed arrangements between Judge Ezra Whitlock and Rourke Moreno. Payments recorded in careful ledger script. The Settlement Protection Statute referenced explicitly as a tool crafted specifically to hand Moreno legal cover for exactly the kind of theft he'd been conducting across the territory for years. Otis carried the papers over to where Rowan still lay in the dirt. Neva's hand still pressed hard against his wound, held them up so Rowan could see, even through the haze of pain clouding his vision. "Look what fell out of the judge's saddlebag," Otis said, grim satisfaction cutting through the chaos. "Reckon this settles a few things." Rowan managed a weak laugh, more grimace than sound. Knew Purdy wasn't wrong about him. "Grudge," Otis called out, for holding the papers high enough for the retreating deputies to see, voice carrying clear across the yard despite his age. "Reckon you'd like to explain this to whoever you answer to back east, because it sure looks, from where I'm standing, like a man who wrote laws to serve his own pocket instead of the people he was sworn to protect." Whitlock's face went the colour of old ash. He wheeled his horse, tried to run, and got exactly 4 strides before Frank's warning shot convinced him that running wasn't going to be an option today. The deputies, seeing their employer's true colours laid bare in black ink and careful signatures, didn't fight to protect him, simply lowered their weapons one by one and let the morning's true accounting finally begin. Rowan spent the next several days in a fever that mirrored, in strange symmetry, the one Neva had suffered the very first week they'd known each other. She barely left his side, packing the wound with the same herbs and roots she'd used on herself so long ago, murmuring the same low words in her own language whenever his breathing turned shallow and uncertain. "You are not permitted to leave me now," she told him more than once, during the worst of the fever, when he drifted somewhere half-conscious and couldn't fully answer her. "Not after everything. Not after I have finally said what I should have said months ago." On the 4th day, the fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in the chair beside the bed, exactly the way he'd once found her asleep beside him after his first wound, the 2 moments folding together across months of shared history. "You're doing that thing again," he said, voice still rough but steady now. Falling asleep, watching over me, her eyes snapped open, and whatever relief crossed her face in that first unguarded second told him everything he needed to know about how frightened she'd truly been. "You are alive," she breathed. "Told you I was too ornery to die in the dirt. You did tell me that." She took his hand, gripping it tight, unwilling to let go, now that letting go no longer felt necessary. "I am choosing to believe it was stubbornness that saved you, and not simply luck. Luck feels too fragile a thing to have carried us this far. Whatever you want to call it," he said, "I'm still here. Reckon that's what matters most." The aftermath took days to fully settle. A federal marshal, summoned by wire from the nearest telegraph office, once word of Whitlock's corruption reached beyond the territory, arrived within the week to take the disgraced judge into custody and begin the slow process of appointing someone honest to replace him. The new circuit judge, a quiet, mysterious woman named Constance Ayres, who'd spent a decade practicing law back east before coming west, for reasons she never fully explained. reviewed the settlement protection statute within her first week on the bench and struck it down entirely, for calling it, in her official ruling, a naked instrument of theft dressed in the language of protection. He met with Roan and Neva personally before delivering that ruling publicly, a courtesy neither of them expected from someone wearing the same title Whitlock had so thoroughly corrupted. For I read through the whole file the marshal brought, Judge Ayers told them, treated across a modest desk in the small courthouse office, papers stacked neat and orderly in front of her. Whitlock's ledgers, Moreno's payments, every ordinance he pushed through under the pretense of settlement protection. She studied them both with sharp, assessing eyes. I want you to know I do not intend to let this territory's law be used as a weapon again, not while I hold this bench. Obliged to hear that, Roan said. Don't thank me yet. A trace of dry humour crossed her serious face. I've only just arrived. 4. Cleaning up after a man like Whitlock takes considerably longer than striking down one bad statute. Her gaze settled on Neva with particular attention. I understand you've been treating settlers in this territory who otherwise couldn't reach a doctor in time. Travels, even to a judge new in town. I do what I can, Neva said carefully, unsure yet how much trust this new authority had earned. See that it continues if you're willing. This territory needs more people willing to help, regardless of which side of an old grievance they happen to stand on. Judge Ayers closed the file in front of her with quiet finality. I intend this bench to reflect that. Going forward, you have my word on it, for whatever a stranger's word is worth to either of you yet. Roan and Neva rode into town together, some days later, to hear that ruling read aloud publicly, and something in the moment felt like the closing of a wound neither of them had fully realized was still open. For they buried Ran on a low rise overlooking the ranch, from within sight of the two markers that already stood there, for because Neva had asked for it plainly, without explanation needed. He belongs near your family now, she said, watching the grave being dug. For he gave his life defending them. But in the end, same as he gave his life failing mine, for at the beginning. Dream's right that his rest should sit somewhere between those two truths. But the warriors returned for the burial, for word having reached their camp within a day of the battle's end, and the ceremony that followed blended traditions neither Rowan nor his own hands fully understood. For though they stood respectfully through all of it, Fred bowed, present for a grief that belonged to Neva's people, but had, her own way, become theirs too. For the old woman who had once explained the weight of Neva's healing lineage to Rowan spoke over the grave, her voice carrying clear across the small gathering. Ran carried a debt heavier than most men could bear even a fraction of, she said. Spent years trying to outrun it, and in the end, he stood still and let it catch him. And paid it in the only currency that could ever have settled it fully. Her eyes found Neva's. That does not erase what was taken. Nothing can erase what was taken. But it changes what remains of him in our memory. For memory, but in the end, the only inheritance any of us truly leave behind. The young girl Neva had begun teaching, stood near the front of the gathering, tears streaming freely, France, and never crossed to stand beside her once the words had finished. An arm wrapped around the girl's shoulders in a gesture that spoke of the family they were slowly, carefully, rebuilding out of loss. For he believed in what you are becoming, Neva told the girl quietly. Last words were about you. About the knowledge surviving even after everything. I intend to make sure he was right. Cried, Neva said, standing over the fresh grave once the ceremony concluded. For the man he should have been from the beginning. For I do not know if that is enough to call it forgiveness, but it is enough, I think, to call it peace. Roan stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, offering the same silent presence she had offered him at his own family's grave, all those months before. From debts he was learning, only be repaid in exactly this way, not erased, fully erased, but honoured, remembered, carried forward by the people left standing. He'd retrieved the silver medallion from Rourke Moreno's body before the man was buried in ground, far less honoured than Ran's, and he'd carried it in his pocket for several days afterward, uncertain what to do with the last physical trace of his first wife. He brought it to Sarah's grave that same evening, alone this time, and knelt in the dirt a long while, turning it over in his hands one final time. Took it back, he told the marker quietly. Don't rightly know what to do with it now. Feels wrong to keep wearing grief around my neck the way that man did, but feels wrong to just throw it away too, like it never mattered. He ended up burying it there, at the base of her marker, a small private ceremony with no audience but the wind and the wide desert sky. For not forgetting. Never forgetting. Just finally letting the physical weight of that particular grief return to the ground alongside everything else it had once belonged to. Neva found him there afterward, understanding without needing to ask what he'd just done. Pratt is a good resting place for it, she said simply. Figured it belonged with her, not around some outlaw's neck, not in my pocket either, honestly being carried around like a debt I hadn't finished paying. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. Feels lighter, somehow, setting it down proper. Grief usually does, she said, once we finally stop carrying it as a weapon and let it simply be a memory instead. Otis and Frank sat together on the corral fence the evening after the burial, neither of them saying much, the particular silence of two men who'd survived something together and hadn't yet found the words to make sense of it. Figure I'd live to see a gunfight like that, Otis said finally, working a piece of straw between his teeth, not at my age. Figured I'd go out same as most old ranch hands, quiet, in a bed complaining about my knees. Ain't dead yet, Frank pointed out. No, reckon I'm not. Otis was quiet a moment longer. Strange thing though, scared as I was, out there behind that trough wouldn't trade it, wouldn't trade a minute of the last year, matter of fact. Never worked a ranch that felt this much like it mattered before. Frank nodded slowly, turning his own hat over in his hands. My mother asked me after whether I regretted staying on. For, whether all this, he gestured vaguely at the ranch, graves on the rise, the whole complicated history of the past year, worth almost dying for. For what'd you tell her? Told her I never felt more like a man worth being than I did standing in that barn loft, doing something that actually mattered. Frank looked out toward the cabin, where lamplight glowed warm against the coming dark. Reckon that's worth more than safety, most days. Otis grunted his agreement, and the two men sat a while longer in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade over land that had asked everything of them, and in its own quiet way given something back in return. The girl's name, France, Roan learned properly for the first time in the weeks following the battle. Alia, 16 years old, quick-eyed, fierce in a way that reminded him, for more with each passing week, for of never at a younger age before the world had hardened her further still. Reminds me of myself, Griever admitted one evening, watching Talia carefully measure dried herbs into a small pouch, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Before everything, for Moreno, I look at her and remember what I might have become if the raid had never come. She's lucky to have you teaching her. I am equally lucky. Neva's voice carried real warmth, for I did not realize, until I began teaching her, how much of my mother's knowledge I had been carrying alone, with no one to pass it forward to. Felt like a weight before, now it feels like purpose. Talia looked up from her work, catching the tail end of the conversation. Ron told me, before he died, that I would carry this forward even further than either of you have. He could see it in how steady my hands already were. She smiled, small and proud. I intend to prove him right. You already are, Neva said, and meant it completely. For life on the ranch slowly found its footing again in the weeks that followed, the way land always does, for indifferent and patient, healing over even its deepest wounds if given enough time and enough care. Otis took to telling the story of the battle with increasingly dramatic embellishments. Frank's account of a mountain lion had nothing on Otis's retelling of the water trough standoff, and Neva teased them both mercilessly about it over supper most evenings, the lightness returning slowly to a household that had earned every ounce of it back. Roan found himself, for more often than not, simply watching her across whatever ordinary task filled their days mending fence, tending the garden, teaching one of the new hands they'd finally hired to read sign in the dirt the way she'd once taught him. France, watching the way grief had settled into something she carried rather than something that carried her. One evening, several weeks after the battle, she found him sitting again on the porch step, same spot where he'd once wept for a wife and son he couldn't bring back. I still haven't told you, he said. Before she could ask what was on his mind, Pratt, I love you. For been meaning to. Kept finding reasons to wait, I remember. Not waiting any more. 4. He turned to face her fully, something steady and certain in his voice that hadn't been there the night of the storm, hadn't fully been there even the night they'd first come together by this same fire. I love you, Nevakiah. Not because some law told me I had to. 4. Not because a collar came off in the rain and left me responsible for what happened after. 4. Because of every single day since. For I chose you anyway. For and would choose you again. For 100 times over. For if the storm brought you to that tree 100 separate times. She was quiet a long moment. And when she finally spoke, for her voice carried a warmth he'd never once heard from her. Not even in their most tender moments. And hear this. And no, I mean every word of it the same way. He said, her voice steady with a warmth that needed no old law to make it true. You are my husband, Cowboy, not because a collar came off in a storm. 4. Because I have watched you choose me, day after day, longer than either of us has kept proper count of. I am only glad, finally, to hear you say it as plainly as I have felt it. They married twice, in the weeks that followed, because one ceremony alone couldn't hold everything the two of them had become to each other. The first was simple, small, for held beneath the wide branches of an old mesquite tree that Neva had chosen herself, out past the north pasture, where the desert opened into something that felt, at dawn, almost sacred. Reviving warriors attended, along with Otis and Frank, and the small handful of new hands who joined the ranch since. Reva wore her own deerskin, mended now with careful new stitching, rather than scraps of old work shirts. And she bound Roan's hair back with a leather cord the same way she'd once bound her own, for a gesture that needed no translation for anyone watching. 4. The old woman who had spoken over Ran's grave led the blessing, her voice rising and falling in the same rhythm as the lullaby Neva had once sung to Roan on a grief-heavy porch, months before either of them understood what they were building. Came to this land a grave with a fence around it, the old woman said, her eyes moving between them both. He is leaving it something else entirely. Let the desert witness what has grown here, where once only loss stood watch. There were no lengthy vows, for a blessing spoken in her own language, and a simple exchange of promises offered plainly in English for everyone present to understand, to protect, for to choose, carry each other's grief alongside their own, for as long as both of them were given. 4. I promise. 4. Roan said, for holding both her hands in his, for to keep choosing you. 4. Every single day. Not because a collar came off in the rain, and not because any law says I must, because there is no version of my life going forward that I want to live without you standing in the middle of it. Promise. Reva answered, her voice steady despite the tears standing bright in her eyes, for that I will never again let another person's law, for another person's fear, pride what I am worth, for who I choose to love. For I choose you, Cowboy, freely, completely, for as long as the desert allows us both to stand upon it. 4. When Roan finally bound the leather cord in her hair, reversing the gesture she had first shown him, the small gathered crowd erupted in the low, warm sound of genuine celebration, for a moment, for watching the joy on every face around them, for it was almost possible to forget how much grief had been required to arrive at this particular morning. 4. The second ceremony came a week later, in town before the new judge, and most of the small community that had watched this whole story unfold from a cautious distance for months. Purdy closed his store for the afternoon to attend, standing near the back of the small crowd, with an expression of genuine pride he hadn't quite expected to feel toward a rancher he'd known since boyhood. Frank's mother, who'd been skeptical of the whole arrangement from the first rumors that reached town, came to offer her blessing once she'd finally met Neva properly and understood exactly what kind of woman her son had been working alongside all this time. I confess I had my doubts, Frank's mother admitted to Neva afterward, holding both her hands warmly. Town talk paints a strange picture sometimes, and I let myself believe more of it than I should have. I am glad to have been wrong. People are, eventually, friends, without any real bitterness behind the words. For I have learnt not to hold it against them, so long as they are willing to see clearly once given the chance. Judge Ayres read the vows with quiet dignity, her own history as an outsider in this territory, lending a particular warmth to the proceedings. 4. and when she pronounced them married under territorial law, the small crowd gathered outside the courthouse cheered loud enough that Roan's ears rang with it the rest of the day. For, under whichever law you prefer, Judge Ayres told them privately afterward, for a rare smile crossing her usually serious face, I'd say this one holds. For both of them do, as far as I'm concerned. Never seen a marriage more thoroughly earned by two people in all my years on the bench. For the whole town seemed to spill into celebration that afternoon. Courthouse steps crowded with well-wishers who, for only a year before, regarded Neva's presence at Rowan's ranch with suspicion or outright hostility. Purdy set out a barrel of cider free to anyone who wanted it. Someone produced a fiddle, and the dusty main street filled with music and dancing that stretched well past sundown. Lanterns strung between buildings, casting warm gold light over a community that had, in its own halting way, finally learned to make room for something it once feared. Strange, is it not, Prince, watching the celebration from the courthouse steps, Rowan's arm around her waist. For a year ago, half these people would have crossed the street rather than stand near me, for now they are dancing at my wedding. People change, Rowan said, slower than they should most times. But they change, or perhaps, she said, they simply needed proof that change was possible before they were willing to risk it themselves. She watched Otis attempt an enthusiastic, thoroughly uncoordinated dance with the postmaster's wife, and laughed, real and unguarded, frown carrying warm across the celebrating street. For either way, I will take it. I have learned not to refuse good things simply because they arrived later than they should have. For a year passed since the night of the storm, the way years do out on the flats, slow in the daily grind of ranch work, impossibly fast in the accumulation of small changes that only became visible looking back. The herd had grown. A second garden plot stood behind the cabin, producing more than the first ever had. Two of the young warriors from Ran's old camp had settled permanently at the ranch, working alongside Otis and Frank in an arrangement that would have seemed impossible to imagine the night Rowan first found Neva tied to that cottonwood. For Neva had continued training Talia through the year that followed, for passing along fragments of the healing knowledge her own mother had given her, foring, piece by careful piece, for that the last thread of her people's oldest wisdom would not end with her after all. The girl came to stay at the ranch 3 days out of every week now, learning splints and salves and the particular patient's healing required. For, and more than once, Rowan caught Neva watching her work with an expression of quiet, fierce pride that reminded him, prime, of exactly what Ran's dying words had promised would survive. Had finally, grudgingly, admitted that the ranch felt more like a real home now than it had in all his years working it, though he'd never say so plainly, preferring instead to grumble about the growing workload while clearly enjoying every minute of it. Frank had taken up with a young woman from town, introduced France, unsurprisingly, by his own mother once. She'd fully come around to trusting the Hargrove Ranch and everyone connected to it. Town itself had changed too, in smaller ways. Purdy's store did steadier business now that the territory's reputation for lawlessness had eased somewhat under Judge Ayres's careful hand. For new families arrived some months, drawn by word that this stretch of Arizona territory had finally found something resembling stability. France, and more than one of them, for upon settling in, fought out Neva directly for medicine when the nearest doctor proved too far or too expensive to reach in time. She never turned anyone away. For, whatever grievances history still carried between her people and the settlers pouring steadily into this land, she decided, somewhere in the year since the battle, that healing didn't require choosing sides. For it only required showing up, hands ready, when someone needed help badly enough to ask for it. Rowan visited the small rise above the ranch that morning, the way he did most anniversaries now, standing among 3 markers instead of 2 Sarah Daniel, and resting together in ground that had asked so much of all of them and finally, in its own patient way, given something back. A year to the week, the storm told them, same habit he'd never quite broken, for though it felt less like grief now and more like simple conversation between people who still mattered to him, for whatever form that mattering took. Ranch is doing well, herds grow near double, Got good people around the place now, people worth trusting, which I wasn't sure I'd ever manage to say again after everything." He looked toward the cabin, smoke rising steady from the chimney where Neva was already at work on the evening meal. "She's teaching a girl the old medicine. Bran would have been proud of that, I think. Way he talked about her, right at the end, that's exactly the thing he wanted most to see happen." The wind moved soft through the dry grass, same as always, and he stood there a while longer, feeling something that had become, for over the past year, like an open wound and more like a scar he'd finally made peace with carrying. "Still miss you," he said quiet. "Prayers Marker specifically. Or always will, but I think you'd understand, better than most, why I had room left over to love somebody else too. For don't figure loving her takes anything away from what we had. Just means there was more room in me than I gave myself credit for." For he touched 2 fingers to each marker, same wordless habit he'd carried for years now, and walked back down toward the cabin, toward the woman and the life waiting for him there, carrying his whole history forward instead of leaving any part of it behind. France, that same evening, Roan stood on the porch, watching Neva work in the garden, sleeves rolled up, hair loose around her shoulders, utterly at home on land that had once belonged only to his grief and now belonged, fully and completely, to both of them. "You removed my loneliness," he said, when she finally noticed him watching and came to join him on the steps. "Same night you removed that collar. Took me a while to understand it, but that's exactly what happened out there in the rain." She settled beside him, leaning into the warmth of his shoulder, watching the sun go down gold and steady over land that had survived storms, betrayal, corruption, and grief, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become something worth calling home. "By our Lord," she said softly, echoing words spoken once in desperation and now offered freely, "simple truth, and by my heart, you are my husband." Desert stretched quiet and endless beyond the fence line, indifferent as ever to the small, stubborn miracle of 2 broken people who had found, in each other, something neither the law nor the world had ever promised them. But they had built it anyway, and it was theirs to keep.